Before we begin tonight's journey through time, tell me, how often do you think about the Roman Empire? Maybe more often than you realize. It's there in the architecture of government buildings, in the Latin roots of the words we speak, in the very concept of republic and senate, in the calendar that marks our days. The Roman Empire, that extraordinary civilization that once ruled the known world, never truly fell. It transformed, evolved, left fingerprints on every aspect of Western culture that we barely notice anymore, because they're so deeply embedded in how we understand the world. Tonight, we're going to trace that story from its legendary beginning to its complex end, or rather, its transformation. This is not a tale of simple rise and fall, but something far more intricate and fascinating. It's a story of ambition and adaptation, of conquest and culture, of how a small settlement beside a river in central Italy grew to dominate 3 continents, how it created systems of law and government that endure today, how it spread ideas and innovations across an empire so vast that historians still marvel at its administrative achievement. So settle in, close your eyes if you wish, and let's walk together through the centuries. Let's watch as Rome grows from myth and mud into marble and majesty, as it weathers storms that would destroy lesser civilizations, as it finally fragments but never truly dies. The journey will take us through palaces and battlefields, through senate chambers and distant frontiers, through moments of triumph and catastrophe. But we'll take our time, because Rome wasn't built in a day, and its story cannot be rushed. The night is long, the tale is vast, and the implications of Rome's existence touch your life in ways you've never imagined. Let us begin where all things Roman begin, in the hills above the Tiber, where legend and history blur into something both greater than fact and rooted in it. The eternal city's mythical foundations. The story Romans told themselves about their origins was dramatic, violent, and touched by the divine. It began not in Rome, but in Troy, that legendary city on the coast of Asia Minor. When the Greeks finally conquered Troy through cunning rather than strength, hiding soldiers in a wooden horse, one Trojan prince escaped the burning city. His name was Aeneas, and he carried his aged father on his back, while leading his young son by the hand. Behind him Troy burned. Ahead lay an uncertain future. Aeneas wandered the Mediterranean for years, driven by destiny and the will of the gods. He was the son of Venus, the goddess of love, and that divine blood meant the gods took particular interest in his fate. After adventures that would later inspire Virgil's Aeneid, Rome's great national epic, Aeneas finally landed on the coast of Latium in central Italy. There, he married the daughter of the local king and founded a dynasty that would, generations later, produce the twins who would build Rome itself. Those twins were Romulus and Remus, born to a Vestal virgin named Rhea Silvia. Their father, she claimed, was Mars, the god of war. Their great-uncle, the king who had usurped the throne from their grandfather, saw them as threats and ordered them drowned in the Tiber. But the servants charged with this task had pity. They placed the infants in a basket and set it adrift on the river, hoping the gods would decide their fate. The basket washed ashore beneath a fig tree at the base of the Palatine Hill. There, a she-wolf found the crying infants. Rather than devouring them, as one might expect of a predator finding helpless prey, the wolf nursed them as if they were her own cubs. Later, a shepherd named Faustulus discovered the boys and raised them as his own sons, teaching them the skills they would need to survive in the rough world of early Latium. Romulus and Remus grew into strong, charismatic young men. They learned of their true heritage and killed the usurper who had tried to drown them, restoring their grandfather to his rightful throne. Then they decided to found a city of their own, at the place where the wolf had saved them. But brothers often quarrel, and divine twins even more so. They disagreed about which hill the city should occupy, about who should rule, about the proper rituals for founding. According to legend, they decided to let the gods choose through augury, the reading of bird signs. Remus saw 6 vultures from the Aventine Hill. Romulus saw 12 from the Palatine. The gods had spoken, or so Romulus claimed. He began marking out the boundaries of his city with a plough, declaring that these would be sacred borders that no one could cross with hostile intent. Remus, bitter about losing the divine lottery, mocked his brother's work in the most tragic version of the story. He jumped over the furrow Romulus had ploughed, crossing the sacred boundary in contempt. Romulus, enraged at this violation, killed his brother. The first blood spilled in Rome's story was fraternal, a brother slaying a brother. Standing over Remus's body, Romulus is said to have pronounced, "So perish anyone who crosses my walls." This happened, according to Roman tradition, on April 21st, 753 BCE. That date, almost certainly more symbolic than historical, marked the beginning of Rome's calendar. For over 1,000 years, Romans would date events from the founding of the city, ab urbe condita. But was any of it true? Did Romulus exist? Were Aeneas and the Trojan connection anything more than patriotic fiction? Modern archaeology paints a different but no less fascinating picture. There was no single founding moment, no Romulus ploughing a sacred boundary. Instead, the hills around the Tiber saw gradual settlement over centuries. Different tribal groups, speaking related Latin dialects, built villages on the hills. These were pastoral people, herding sheep and pigs, farming small plots, living in simple huts with thatched roofs. The Palatine Hill, where legend placed Romulus's city, shows archaeological evidence of habitation going back to the 10th century BCE. Around the 8th century BCE, these separate hill settlements began to coalesce. The Forum, the low valley between the hills that would become Rome's civic centre, was originally a marshy burial ground. Its drainage and paving marked a transition from scattered villages to unified city. The development was driven by the Etruscans, that mysterious people who dominated central Italy before Rome's rise. They brought urban planning, monumental architecture, political organization, and something perhaps more important, the idea that a city could be more than just a defensive position, that it could be a stage for civic life, a community defined by shared institutions rather than just shared blood. But the Romans never forgot their mythical origins, never stopped telling the story of Romulus and Remus. Myth and history intertwined so completely that separating them became impossible and perhaps pointless. The story of the fratricide founding expressed something true about Rome's character, that it was born in violence, that it would be shaped by violence, that brothers would fight brothers in civil wars that nearly destroyed what they sought to preserve. The she-wolf nursing human infants captured Rome's dual nature, civilized and savage, nurturing and predatory, human ambition protected by animal ferocity. And the claim of Trojan ancestry, however historically dubious, connected Rome to the Greek heroic tradition while maintaining Roman distinctiveness. Romans were not Greeks, but they were descended from Greeks' great enemies, making them equals in antiquity and glory. When Rome eventually conquered Greece, this mythology allowed them to see themselves not as barbarian conquerors, but as Trojans finally achieving revenge for their city's destruction. History is written by victors, but first, it is imagined by those who aspire to victory. The centuries between legendary founding and historical certainty are shrouded in the mists that obscure all ancient history. But gradually, through archaeology and careful reading of later sources, we can reconstruct the early Roman world. It was a world of small city-states competing for resources in central Italy, of constant warfare between neighbours, of gradual Roman expansion fueled by military necessity as much as ambition. It was a world being shaped by the mysterious Etruscan civilization to the north, and increasingly by Greek colonies to the south. Rome stood between these two advanced cultures, absorbing from both, creating something unique, the kingdom. Period. 7 kings and Etruscan influence. Roman tradition held that the city was ruled by 7 kings between its founding in 753 BCE and the establishment of the Republic in 509 BCE. These kings were both historical and legendary, their reigns preserved in stories that mixed genuine memory with patriotic embellishment and moral instruction. Each king supposedly contributed something essential to Rome's development. Each left a mark that would endure through all later history. After Romulus came Numa Pompilius, chosen, according to legend, for his wisdom and piety rather than his military prowess. Where Romulus had been a warrior king, Numa was a priest king. He established Rome's religious calendar, created the colleges of priests who would maintain the gods' favor, built the Temple of Janus, whose doors stood open in wartime and closed in peace. The doors, it was said, were almost always open. Numa's supposed reign was an era of peace and religious organization, setting patterns of worship that would last 1,000 years. The third king, Tullus Hostilius, returned Rome to its warlike ways. His name, Hostilius, literally meant hostile, and he lived up to it. He conquered and destroyed Rome's mother city, Alba Longa, settling the rivalry between the two Latin settlements. The destruction of Alba Longa marked an important transition. Rome was no longer just another Latin town, but the dominant power in Latium. The conquered people were absorbed into Rome, swelling its population and setting a pattern that would define Roman expansion. Conquest meant not just tribute, but incorporation, turning enemies into citizens, making Rome stronger with each victory. Ancus Marcius, the fourth king, was a grandson of Numa who tried to balance his grandfather's piety with military necessity. He extended Roman power to the sea, capturing the port at Ostia at the mouth of the Tiber. This was Rome's first step beyond Latium proper, its first real connection to Mediterranean trade networks. Control of Ostia meant control of the river, and control of the river meant Rome could not be starved out by enemies controlling the surrounding hills. The fifth king marked a dramatic shift. Lucius Tarquinius Priscus was not born Roman, but Etruscan, from the sophisticated cities to the north. His very name, Tarquin, was Etruscan. He came to Rome seeking opportunity and found it, rising through his talent and ambition until the people chose him as king. His reign brought Etruscan culture flooding into Rome. Monumental architecture, public works, gladiatorial games, the triumph ceremony that would celebrate military victories for centuries to come. Under Tarquin the Elder, Rome began to look like a real city rather than an overgrown village. The Circus Maximus, that great racetrack where Romans would later watch chariot races, was first laid out in his reign. He drained the Forum, transforming it from marshy ground to civic center. He began the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline Hill, which would become Rome's most sacred shrine. These projects required organization, labor, taxation, planning, all the apparatus of a real state rather than a tribal confederation. The sixth king, Servius Tullius, was either Tarquin's son-in-law or, in some versions, a slave's son raised in the palace. Regardless of his origins, his reforms fundamentally shaped Roman society. He divided the population into classes based on wealth rather than birth, created the Comitia Centuriata assembly organized by those classes, and built the Servian Wall that enclosed all 7 of Rome's hills in a single defensive perimeter. These reforms began the long transformation from tribal monarchy to civic republic, from a society organized by family ties to one organized by property and contribution to the state. The 7th and final king was Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud, who seized power by murdering his father-in-law Servius Tullius. His reign was remembered as tyrannical, a descent into the despotism that earlier kings had avoided. He ruled without consulting the Senate, killed or exiled opponents, used his sons to enforce his will. The final break came when his son Sextus raped Lucretia, the wife of a Roman nobleman. Lucretia, after making her husband and father swear to avenge her, took her own life. Her death became a rallying point for those tired of Tarquin's tyranny. Led by Lucius Junius Brutus, a group of Roman nobles rose up in 509 BCE, expelled Tarquin and his family, and declared that Rome would never again be ruled by kings. The monarchy was abolished. In its place, they created the Republic, a res publica, a public thing, belonging to the people rather than any king. 2 consuls would be elected annually to wield executive power. The Senate would advise and ultimately control policy. The people, organized in assemblies, would vote on laws and elect magistrates. It was an experiment, a rejection of monarchical tradition that dominated the ancient world, and it would last nearly 500 years. But how much of this story was real? The later Romans certainly believed it, celebrating the anniversary of Tarquin's expulsion as the birthday of liberty. Archaeological evidence confirms that Rome in the 6th century BCE was influenced heavily by Etruscan culture, that major building projects were undertaken, that the city grew rapidly in size and sophistication. The names of the kings appear in various ancient sources with remarkable consistency, suggesting they preserve genuine memory. Yet the tidy succession, the neat moral lessons each reign provides, the perfect symbolism of each king's contributions, these suggest storytelling as much as history. The reality was probably messier, overlapping reigns, forgotten rulers. Conflicts collapsed into single dramatic narratives. The story of Lucretia's rape and the expulsion of the kings has parallels in Greek political mythology, suggesting Romans adapted Greek tales to explain their own political transformation. What we can say with confidence is that Rome in the 6th century BCE was transformed by Etruscan influence, grew rapidly in population and territory, developed political institutions that would shape its future, and eventually rejected monarchical rule in favor of something new. The Etruscans themselves were being challenged by Greek colonies in southern Italy, creating political pressures that may have made monarchy unsustainable. The Roman aristocracy, the patrician families who would dominate the early republic, may have seen opportunity in replacing one king with councils they could control. The transition from kingdom to republic was not sudden or complete. Etruscan influence continued for decades. Some offices retained royal trappings. The Rex Sacrorum, a priest who performed the religious duties formerly done by kings, kept the title and some ceremonial power. The fasces, those bundles of rods with an axe that symbolized the power to beat and execute, continued to be carried before Roman magistrates. These were Etruscan symbols, and they would march through Roman history for 1,000 years, eventually inspiring the fascist movements of the 20th century with their name and iconography. But something fundamental had changed. Rome had committed itself to a political experiment based on shared power, limited terms, and the rule of law rather than the will of a monarch. It was not democracy, not in any modern sense, or even in the Athenian sense. Power remained concentrated in the hands of aristocratic families, but it was a form of government that would prove remarkably flexible, capable of adaptation, able to expand to rule an empire while maintaining at least the forms of republican institutions. The Roman Republic was born, and with it came centuries of expansion, internal conflict, cultural flowering, and the seeds of its own transformation into empire. The early Republic, struggle and expansion. The early Roman Republic was not the confident, powerful state of later centuries. It was vulnerable, surrounded by enemies, internally divided, fighting for survival. The expulsion of the Tarquin kings was just the beginning of Rome's troubles, not the end. Tarquin himself did not accept exile peacefully, but sought help from Etruscan cities to regain his throne. Lars Porsena, the powerful king of Clusium, may have actually captured Rome briefly, though later Romans preferred to remember his withdrawal after being impressed by Roman courage. The story they told involved Horatius Cocles, who single-handedly held a bridge over the Tiber while the Romans destroyed it behind him, then swam to safety despite his wounds. Or Gaius Mucius Scaevola, who attempted to assassinate Porsenna and when captured, thrust his right hand into a fire to demonstrate Roman fearlessness, making Porsenna so impressed that he made peace. These were legends almost certainly, but they express something real about early Rome. It survived through determination, through a willingness to sacrifice, through convincing enemies that Romans would never submit. Throughout the 5th century BCE, Rome fought constant wars with its neighbours. The Aequian Volsci, hill tribes from the Apennines, raided regularly. The Latin League, Rome's former allies and kinsmen, grew resentful of Roman dominance and had to be fought. Etruscan cities, declining but still formidable, pressed from the north. The greatest enemy was Veii, an Etruscan city just 12 miles north of Rome. The two cities fought intermittently for over a century, competing for control of the same territory, neither able to decisively defeat the other. The siege of Veii, which according to tradition lasted 10 years like the Trojan War, finally ended around 396 BCE with Roman victory. The commander Marcus Furius Camillus was celebrated as Rome's second founder. Veii's destruction doubled Rome's territory and provided land for thousands of Roman citizens. But even this victory brought new challenges. The Gauls, Celtic warriors from beyond the Alps, were moving into northern Italy, and they would soon threaten Rome itself. In 390 BCE, or possibly 387 BCE, depending on which ancient chronology one trusts, disaster struck. A Gallic warband led by a chief the Romans called Brennus marched south, defeated a Roman army at the river Allia, and descended on Rome. The city, whose walls had been neglected in decades of offensive warfare, could not be defended. The population fled. Only the capital, Rome's citadel, held out. The Gauls occupied and burned the city, besieged the capital, and demanded ransom for leaving. The story goes that as the gold was being weighed, the Romans complained that the Gauls were using false weights. Brennus threw his sword onto the scale and declared, "Vae victis," woe to the conquered. This moment of humiliation burned into Roman memory. Never again would Rome be caught unprepared. New walls were built, the Servian walls whose remains can still be seen in modern Rome. The army was reorganized, and Rome developed an almost paranoid determination never to be conquered again. But the real struggle in early Republican Rome was not primarily external, but internal. Roman society was divided into two classes whose conflict defined the first 2 centuries of the Republic. The patricians were the old aristocratic families who traced their ancestry to the legendary founding, who held all major priesthoods, who monopolized political office. The plebeians were everyone else: small farmers, artisans, merchants, even wealthy landowners whose families were simply not patrician. They had no access to political power despite being the majority of citizens and the backbone of the army. This struggle of the orders, as historians call it, could have torn Rome apart. In other cities, it did lead to civil war, tyranny, or permanent class oppression. But Rome found a characteristically Roman solution: gradual compromise and institutional innovation. The plebeians, recognizing that their military service gave them leverage, threatened to secede, to leave Rome, and found their own city. Since Rome's military power depended on plebeian farmers serving as infantry, this was a genuine threat. Rather than fight, the patricians negotiated. In 494 BCE, the plebeians were allowed to elect their own officials, called tribunes of the plebs, who could veto any action by magistrates or the Senate. These tribunes were sacrosanct, meaning anyone who harmed them was cursed and could be killed without trial. It was a radical innovation, creating officials whose entire purpose was to protect one class of citizens against the other. Over the following 2 centuries, concessions continued. In 451–450 BCE, the Law of the 12 Tables was created, Rome's first written law code. It was not particularly enlightened by modern standards, but it established that law was public knowledge, not the secret property of patrician priests. In 367 BCE, the Licinian Sextian laws opened the consulship to plebeians, ending patrician monopoly on executive power. Eventually, all offices were open to plebeians, and wealthy plebeian families merged with patricians to create a new nobility, the nobiles, defined by achievement rather than birth alone. This process of conflict and compromise created remarkable stability. Instead of revolution or tyranny, Rome achieved a system where different classes had recognized roles, where ambitious individuals could rise through merit, where political conflict was channeled through institutions rather than violence. It was not egalitarian. Wealth still mattered enormously. Slavery was fundamental to the economy. Women had no political rights. But compared to most ancient societies, it was remarkably flexible and inclusive for male citizens. The military system evolved alongside political institutions. The early republic fought with a phalanx, the Greek-style formation of massed spearmen, but sometime in the 4th century BCE, probably in response to the rough Italian terrain and the need for flexibility against diverse enemies, Rome developed the manipular legion. Instead of one rigid block, the legion was organized into smaller units called maniples that could maneuver independently. Each soldier, the legionary, carried not a long spear but a javelin to throw and a short sword for close combat. The formation was more flexible, more adaptable, better suited to the warfare Rome faced. This new military system, combined with Rome's growing population and resources, made it increasingly formidable. One by one, Rome's Italian neighbors were defeated, not always through direct conquest, but often through alliance systems that gave Rome control of their foreign policy while allowing local autonomy. The Latin League was dissolved in 338 BCE after a rebellion, its members incorporated into the Roman state, or becoming Rome's allies with varying degrees of independence. The Samnite Wars, 3 conflicts stretching from 343 to 290 BCE, were the greatest challenge of the Middle Republic. The Samnites were tough mountain people who controlled much of central southern Italy. The wars were brutal, swinging back and forth, marked by disasters like the Battle of the Caudine Forks, where a Roman army was trapped and forced to pass under a yoke in humiliating surrender. But Rome's determination and systematic approach to warfare eventually prevailed. By 290 BCE, Samnite power was broken, and Rome dominated central Italy. Only the Greek cities of southern Italy remained outside Roman control. These cities, Tarentum and Neapolis and others, were wealthy and sophisticated, part of the broader Greek world. When Rome threatened them, they did what Greek cities facing barbarian threat often did. They called for help from Greece proper. King Pyrrhus of Epirus, one of the great commanders of the age, answered the call. He crossed to Italy with a professional army and war elephants, creatures the Romans had never seen before. Pyrrhus won victories at Heraclea in 280 BCE and Asculum in 279 BCE, but his losses were so severe that he supposedly said, "Another such victory, and I am lost." The Pyrrhic victory entered our language as a metaphor for winning at unsustainable cost. After years of campaigning, Pyrrhus withdrew to Greece, and the southern Italian Greeks submitted to Rome. By 264 BCE, all of Italy south of the Po Valley was under Roman control or alliance. This achievement was remarkable. In less than 2.5 centuries, Rome had grown from a vulnerable city-state to the master of peninsular Italy. The foundation was military effectiveness and determination, but also the Roman system of alliances. Defeated enemies were not simply subjugated, but incorporated into a hierarchy of relationships. Some became full Roman citizens, others became allies with various obligations, but also protections. Latin colonies, new settlements of Roman and Latin citizens, were planted in strategic locations to hold conquered territory. Roads were built connecting these colonies to Rome, creating an infrastructure of control. The system was exploitative, certainly. Rome extracted military manpower from allies, demanded their participation in Roman wars, controlled their foreign policy, but it also offered benefits: protection from other enemies, access to Roman markets, the possibility of eventual citizenship, and crucially, it allowed local communities to maintain their own governments, laws, and customs. Rome wanted obedience, not uniformity. This pragmatic approach to empire would serve it well in the centuries to come. By 264 BCE, Rome stood at a crossroads. It controlled Italy, commanded vast resources, fielded armies more effective than any in the Western Mediterranean. But it had never fought a naval war, never confronted a power that could match its resources. All of that was about to change. Across the narrow strait separating Sicily from Italy, another power watched Rome's rise with concern. Carthage, the great Phoenician trading empire of North Africa, controlled western Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, and the western Mediterranean sea lanes. The two powers, Roman land empire and Carthaginian sea empire, were about to collide in a struggle that would last more than a century and transform both civilizations. Rome's Mediterranean dominance, the Punic Wars, the First Punic War began in 264 BCE over Sicily, that large island at Italy's toe whose position made it strategically and economically vital. Greek cities controlled eastern Sicily, Carthage controlled the west, and the island had been a battleground for generations. When Mamertines, Italian mercenaries who had seized the city of Messana, appealed to both Rome and Carthage for protection against Syracuse, the Greek power in Sicily, the stage was set for conflict. Rome faced a crucial decision. Sicily was not part of Italy proper. Roman expansion had always been on land, against neighbors who threatened Roman territory. Crossing to Sicily meant entering a different sphere, challenging Carthage, fighting a naval power. The Senate was cautious, understanding the implications, but the popular assembly, perhaps seeing opportunity for plunder and glory, voted to aid the Mamertines. Roman forces crossed to Sicily and the war began. The challenge seemed insurmountable. Carthage was a maritime empire, heir to Phoenician trading traditions stretching back centuries. Its navy was the most powerful in the Mediterranean, its ships crewed by experienced sailors, its tactics refined through generations of warfare. Rome had no navy at all. Roman citizens were farmers and soldiers, not sailors. The very idea of Romans fighting at sea seemed absurd. But Rome did what Rome did best. It adapted. When a Carthaginian quinquereme, a warship with 5 banks of oars, ran aground on the Italian coast, the Romans studied it carefully. They built copies, reverse engineering Carthaginian naval technology. Training sailors was another matter. According to tradition, they had men practice rowing on benches on shore before ever boarding ships, learning the rhythm and coordination required. It was crude but effective enough to get fleets to sea. The Roman innovation was the corvus, the crow, a boarding bridge with a spike that could be dropped onto enemy ships, locking them together. This transformed naval combat from maneuver and ramming, where Carthaginian skill was decisive, into boarding actions where Roman legionaries could fight hand-to-hand combat they understood. The corvus was unwieldy, made ships top-heavy and prone to capsizing in storms, but it worked. At the Battle of Mylae in 260 BCE, Rome won its first major naval victory, capturing 50 Carthaginian ships. The war ground on for 23 years, much of it in Sicily. Rome learned harsh lessons about naval warfare when storms destroyed entire fleets. The expedition to Africa, led by Marcus Atilius Regulus, initially succeeded, but then catastrophically failed when Regulus was defeated and captured by Carthaginian forces under Spartan general Xanthippus. The war became a test of endurance, of which power could sustain losses and keep fighting. Rome's advantage was its Italian alliance system. When fleets were destroyed, New ones were built with resources drawn from the entire peninsula. Carthage, despite its wealth, was ultimately a trading city dependent on mercenaries and subject peoples who felt no loyalty. When the final great naval battle came at the Aegates Islands in 241 BCE, Rome's rebuilt fleet defeated Carthage decisively. Carthage, exhausted and facing revolt from unpaid mercenaries, sued for peace. The treaty was harsh. Carthage had to evacuate. Sicily, which became Rome's first province, pay a large indemnity and agree not to make war without Roman permission. More humiliatingly, while Carthage struggled with a mercenary revolt, Rome seized Sardinia and Corsica, claiming Carthage had threatened Roman merchants. It was naked aggression, justified by Roman power, and Carthage never forgot the injustice. The period between the First and Second Punic Wars saw Carthage rebuild under the Barcid family. Hamilcar Barca, the general who had fought Romans in Sicily, led Carthaginian expansion in Spain, conquering territory and extracting silver that funded military rebuilding. He reportedly made his young son Hannibal swear eternal hatred of Rome. When Hamilcar died, his son-in-law Hasdrubal continued the expansion, founding New Carthage, modern Cartagena, as the capital of Carthaginian Spain. When Hasdrubal was assassinated, command fell to Hannibal, now in his 20s. Hannibal was a military genius, perhaps the greatest tactical commander Rome ever faced. He had grown up in military camps, learned warfare from childhood, nursed the hatred of Rome his father had instilled. When Rome made an alliance with Saguntum, a Spanish city south of the Tiber River that Rome and Carthage had agreed as their boundary, Hannibal saw opportunity. He besieged and captured Saguntum. Rome demanded Carthage hand over Hannibal. Carthage refused. In 218 BCE, the Second Punic War began. What happened next was one of history's great military adventures. Rather than wait for Rome to attack, Hannibal decided to invade Italy itself, bringing the war to Roman territory. But he could not go by sea. Rome controlled those routes now. Instead, he would march overland from Spain, through southern Gaul, across the Alps, into northern Italy. It was a journey of staggering difficulty, made in late spring with an army of perhaps 50,000 men, and famously, dozens of war elephants. The Alpine crossing was a nightmare. The passes were narrow, the weather turning cold. Hostile tribes attacked the column. The elephants, struggling on icy slopes, became as much liability as asset. Many died. Many more would die in northern Italy's first winter. But Hannibal got his army through, emerging into the Po Valley, to the shock of Rome and the delight of Rome's recent enemies, the Gauls of northern Italy, who eagerly joined his cause. Rome's response was to send armies north to crush this insolent invasion. At the Tiber River in December 218 BCE, Hannibal lured a Roman army into ambush, hiding cavalry and light troops on the flanks, and destroyed it. At Lake Trasimene the following June, he ambushed another Roman army in morning fog, driving it into the lake and killing 15,000 men, including the consul. Rome was in panic. Hannibal was in Italy, defeating every army sent against him, and no one knew how to stop him. Rome appointed a dictator, Fabius Maximus, who adopted the strategy that would bear his name, Fabian strategy, or attrition warfare. Fabius refused to give battle. Instead, he shadowed Hannibal's army, harassing it, denying it supplies, preventing it from capturing major cities. It was sensible but unpopular. Romans wanted their generals to fight, to defend Roman honor, not skulk in the hills like frightened shepherds. The people demanded battle. They got it at Cannae on August 2nd, 216 BCE. Rome assembled the largest army it had ever fielded, perhaps 80,000 men, and sent it to destroy Hannibal. The battle that followed became a textbook example of military genius. Hannibal, with a smaller force of perhaps 50,000, arranged his infantry in a crescent formation, deliberately weak in the center. When the Romans charged, as he knew they would, their mass pushed his center back. But this was exactly what Hannibal wanted. As the Roman legions pushed forward, focusing on the apparently breaking center, Hannibal's cavalry defeated the Roman cavalry on both wings. The Carthaginian infantry wings then closed in from the sides, and the cavalry attacked from behind. The Romans were surrounded, compressed into a smaller and smaller space where their numbers became a disadvantage. They could not maneuver, could hardly lift their weapons. What followed was systematic slaughter. Some 50,000 to 70,000 Romans died at Cannae, including both consuls, 80 senators, and thousands of officers and soldiers who represented Rome's military elite. It was the worst defeat in Roman history, worse than any before or since. Hannibal sent rings taken from fallen Roman nobles to Carthage as proof of his victory, supposedly filling several bushels. Cities throughout southern Italy, seeing Rome's weakness, defected to Hannibal. Capua, the second largest city in Italy, opened its gates to him. Syracuse in Sicily revolted against Roman control. Philip V of Macedon allied with Hannibal, opening an eastern front. Rome seemed on the verge of collapse, but Rome did not collapse. This is perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the Second Punic War. Any other ancient state, suffering such catastrophic losses, would have sued for peace on any terms. Rome did not. When Hannibal sent a delegation offering to negotiate, the Senate refused even to meet with them. Instead, Rome grimly set about continuing the war. New legions were raised from boys too young and men too old for normal service, even from slaves promised freedom. The Senate told the people that the war would continue until Hannibal was driven from Italy or Rome was destroyed. There would be no third option. The key to Roman survival was the alliance system. Most Italian allies remained loyal, partly from self-interest, partly from fear of Roman vengeance, but also perhaps from genuine attachment to the Roman system. The defections to Hannibal were significant, but not universal. Rome still commanded enormous manpower reserves, and Hannibal, for all his tactical brilliance, faced strategic problems he could not solve. He could not assault Rome itself. The city's walls and garrison were too strong. He could not force the Italian allies to defect en masse. Too many remained loyal, and Carthage, engaged in its own wars in Spain and Africa, sent him little reinforcement. So the war became a grinding stalemate. Hannibal remained in Italy for 15 years, winning battles, raiding territories, but unable to deliver a knockout blow. Rome adopted Fabian tactics, refusing pitched battles, slowly reconquering defected cities through siege warfare. In Spain, Roman generals slowly pushed Carthaginian forces back. One of those generals was Publius Cornelius Scipio, whose father and uncle had both died fighting in Spain. Young Scipio was given command at age 25, an almost unprecedented honor, and he would prove worth it. Scipio captured New Carthage in a brilliant assault, adopted and adapted Hannibal's tactical innovations, and by 206 BCE had driven Carthaginian forces from Spain. Then he did something even more audacious. He proposed invading Africa itself, striking at Carthage's heartland. The Senate was reluctant, fearing to denude Italy of defenders while Hannibal was still present. But Scipio was allowed to raise volunteers, and in 214 BCE he landed in Africa. The invasion forced Carthage to recall Hannibal from Italy. After 15 years ravaging the peninsula, Hannibal was summoned home to defend Carthage itself. The two generals, the greatest tacticians of their age, would finally meet in battle at Zama in 202 BCE. Scipio had learned from Hannibal's tactics, adopted Numidian cavalry similar to Carthage's, and deployed his legion with gaps that allowed Hannibal's elephants to pass through harmlessly. When the battle was joined, Scipio's cavalry, commanded by the Numidian prince Massinissa, who had switched sides, defeated Hannibal's cavalry as Hannibal had so often defeated Roman cavalry. Then they returned to attack Hannibal's infantry from behind, as Hannibal had done at Cannae. Hannibal was defeated by his own methods. It was not disgraceful. He faced a brilliant general who had studied him carefully and had better resources. But it ended the war. Carthage sued for peace on Roman terms. The conditions were devastating. Carthage lost all territory outside Africa, was forbidden to wage war without Roman permission, had to pay a massive indemnity over 50 years, and was required to hand over all but 10 of its warships. Hannibal, the man who had terrorized Italy, became a civilian magistrate, trying to reform Carthage's corrupt government. Rome had won the greatest war of the ancient world. The victory transformed the Mediterranean. Rome was no longer just a regional power, but the dominant force in the Western Mediterranean. More subtly, the war transformed Rome itself. The long struggle had militarized Roman society, made warfare central to Roman identity, in ways that would shape all future development. The Senate, which had coordinated the war effort, emerged with enhanced prestige, and the Italian alliance system, tested to destruction, had held, proving the Roman method of empire building could survive existential crisis. But Carthage's humiliation was not complete. The city's commercial recovery was so successful that within decades it was wealthy again, if no longer powerful. Some Romans, particularly Cato the Elder, viewed this with alarm. Cato famously ended every speech in the Senate on any topic with the phrase Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed. When Carthage, attacked by Rome's ally Massinissa, and forbidden to defend itself without Roman permission, finally fought back in 150 BCE, Rome saw its excuse. The Third Punic War was not really a war, but a siege and an execution. Rome demanded Carthage disarm and relocate 10 miles inland, away from the sea that had been the city's life for centuries. When Carthage refused, knowing this meant death regardless, the city was besieged. For 3 years the Carthaginians held out, turning their city into a fortress, manufacturing weapons from melted down statues, holding every street against Roman assault. Finally, in 146 BCE, Scipio Aemilianus, adopted grandson of Scipio Africanus, took the city block by block. The surviving Carthaginians were enslaved. The city was systematically destroyed. According to legend, though this may be later invention, the ruins were ploughed with salt so nothing would grow there again. In the same year, 146 BCE, Rome destroyed Corinth in Greece, ending that city's resistance to Roman expansion. The two destructions, at opposite ends of the Mediterranean, marked Rome's arrival as the undisputed master of the Mediterranean world. No power remained that could challenge Rome on equal terms. The era of Mediterranean empires, Carthage, the Hellenistic kingdoms descended from Alexander's successors, was ending. Rome's era was beginning. The conquest of the Greek East had begun earlier and was more gradual than the struggle with Carthage. Rome had first intervened in Greece in 200 BCE, responding to appeals from Greek cities threatened by Philip V of Macedon, the same Philip who had allied with Hannibal. The Romans portrayed themselves as liberators, defeating Philip at Cynocephaly in 197 BCE, then famously declaring Greek cities free at the Isthmian Games in 196 BCE. It was propaganda. Of course, Rome retained ultimate control, but it was effective propaganda. Many Greeks genuinely saw Rome as a protector against Macedonian and Syrian imperialism. Over the following decades, Roman influence in Greece became control, and control became conquest. When Perseus of Macedon challenged Roman dominance, he was defeated at Pydna in 168 BCE by Lucius Aemilius Paulus, whose victory demonstrated the superiority of the legion over the Macedonian phalanx. Macedon was divided into 4 republics under Roman supervision. When the Macedonians rebelled in 149 BCE, the rebellion was crushed, and Macedon became a Roman province. The Seleucid Empire, the great Hellenistic kingdom that controlled much of Alexander's eastern conquests, was humiliated without even a war. When Antiochus III invaded Egypt, threatening Roman interests, Rome sent an ambassador named Gaius Popilius Laenas to warn him off. Laenas drew a circle around Antiochus in the sand and demanded he decide whether to obey Rome before stepping out of that circle. The Syrian king, recognizing that Rome's power made resistance futile, withdrew. The story, whether true or embellished, captured Rome's growing dominance. A Roman ambassador could humiliate a great king with a drawn line in sand. By the mid-2nd century BCE, Rome controlled or dominated the entire Mediterranean basin. It had not sought this systematically. Each war seemed justified by immediate threats or opportunities. But the cumulative effect was an empire, though Romans were slow to use that word. Provinces were governed by former consuls or praetors, extracting taxes and maintaining order. Roman businessmen flooded the eastern Mediterranean, exploiting new opportunities. Slaves from conquered territories poured into Italy, transforming the economy. The cultural impact was equally profound. Rome was exposed to Greek culture, philosophy, art, literature, science, at a level far beyond previous contact. The conquest was military and political. But culturally, as the poet Horace later wrote, captive Greece took captive her savage conqueror. Educated Romans learned Greek, read Greek literature, studied with Greek philosophers. Greek rhetorical and philosophical education became standard for Roman elite. Greek art and architectural styles were adopted. Greek gods were identified with Roman gods, creating a shared pantheon. This Hellenization was not universal or uncontested. Romans like Cato the Elder feared that Greek culture would corrupt Roman virtue, that the stern values that had built Rome's power would be lost in Greek sophistication. They passed laws against Greek philosophers teaching in Rome, denounced Greek customs, insisted on Roman simplicity. But they were fighting a losing battle. Rome was becoming a cosmopolitan empire, and cosmopolitan empires absorb the cultures they conquer. The synthesis of Roman and Greek culture would produce something extraordinary. Roman literature, which had been functional and practical, began to produce works that matched Greek achievements. Plautus and Terence wrote comedies adapted from Greek plays but with Roman sensibilities. Ennius wrote a Roman epic history. Later writers like Cicero and Virgil would create Latin literary masterpieces that rivaled anything in Greek. Roman law and political institutions would be explained and analyzed using Greek philosophical concepts. The combination of Greek intellectual sophistication and Roman practical organization would define Western culture for millennia, but the rapid conquest and cultural transformation also created enormous social and economic stress within Roman society. The republican system, designed for a city-state, was straining to govern an empire. The next century would see that system tested to destruction in civil wars that would transform Rome from republic to empire, from collective rule to rule, by one man who would style himself as the first among equals, but would ultimately be emperor in all but name. The crisis of the late Republic victory brought Rome wealth beyond anything it had known, but wealth brought problems that would ultimately destroy the republican system. The Italian countryside, once farmed by the small landowners who made up Rome's legions, was increasingly dominated by huge estates called latifundia, worked by slaves captured in Rome's wars. Those former farmers, displaced from their land, flooded into Rome seeking work and sustenance. The city swelled with an unemployed mob that had to be fed and entertained to prevent social unrest. The wars themselves had changed character. Expansion required long campaigns far from Italy, in Spain, in Asia, in Africa. Farmers could not afford to spend years away from their land. The requirement that soldiers equip themselves at their own expense meant the poorest citizens were excluded from military service. The army was becoming professional, soldiers whose loyalty was increasingly to their generals, who promised them land and plunder rather than to the abstract republic. The Senate, that body of former magistrates who advised the consuls and controlled foreign policy and finances, had become an oligarchy of noble families who monopolized political offices and resisted reform. The political system that had worked for a city-state governing Italy was buckling under the strain of empire. Different groups, senators, equestrians, the wealthy business class, Italian allies, the urban poor, soldiers, all had competing interests that the traditional system could not reconcile. The crisis began with the Gracchi brothers, idealistic reformers who sought to address the land problem. Tiberius Gracchus, elected tribune in 133 BCE, proposed redistributing public land to poor citizens. The proposal was reasonable. Much public land was illegally occupied by wealthy senators, but it threatened powerful interests. When the Senate maneuvered against him, Tiberius circumvented normal procedures, appealing directly to the people. This violated unwritten rules that made the republican system work. When Tiberius sought re-election as tribune, which was possibly illegal, a senatorial mob killed him and 300 of his supporters. 10 years later, his younger brother Gaius Gracchus became tribune and pushed even more radical reforms. Subsidized grain distributions to the urban poor, colonies for landless citizens, extension of citizenship to Italian allies. He built a political coalition that threatened senatorial control. When he sought a third tribunate, violence erupted again. Gaius and 3,000 supporters were killed. The Republic had crossed a threshold. Political violence, previously unthinkable, had become a tool for defending interests. The social war of 91-88 BCE nearly destroyed Rome. The Italian allies, who had fought Rome's wars and made Rome's conquests, demanded Roman citizenship and equal political rights. When the Senate refused, most of Italy rose in revolt. For 2 years, Rome fought against its own allies, a brutal civil war that devastated the peninsula. Rome finally won by promising citizenship to those who laid down arms and ruthlessly crushing holdouts. The result was expansion of citizenship, turning Italy into a unified political community, but also enormous bitterness and thousands of deaths. Into this chaos came Gaius Marius, a military genius from a non-noble family who revolutionized the Roman army. Facing a crisis in the Jugurthine War in North Africa and the threat of Germanic tribes invading Italy, Marius ignored property requirements and recruited the poorest citizens into the legions, equipping them at state expense. These soldiers, landless and desperate, served for decades, looking to their general to secure them land grants upon retirement. Marius was elected consul an unprecedented 7 times, violating the traditional cursus honorum that limited offices and required intervals between terms. Marius's reforms created effective legions that stopped the Germanic invasion, destroying the Cimbri and Teutones in massive battles. But they also tied soldiers' loyalty to generals rather than the state. When rival generals commanded different factions in Roman politics, their armies became private forces in political struggles. The Marian reforms made later civil wars possible, perhaps inevitable. The contest between Marius and Sulla, his former subordinate, turned from political rivalry to civil war. When the Senate granted Sulla command against Mithridates, the dangerous king of Pontus who threatened Roman Asia, a tribune in Marius's faction transferred the command to Marius instead. Sulla responded by doing something no Roman general had ever done. He marched his legions on Rome itself. The city was taken, Sulla's enemies fled, and he departed for the east, leaving a fragile settlement. While Sulla fought Mithridates, his enemies seized Rome. When he returned in 83 BCE, civil war erupted again. Sulla marched through Italy, defeating his opponents in brutal battles, culminating in his victory at the Colline Gate, where Rome itself nearly fell to his enemies. Sulla then initiated the proscriptions, posting lists of political enemies who could be killed on sight, their property confiscated. Thousands died in the terror, their heads displayed in the forum as warning to others. Sulla had himself appointed dictator, but unlike previous dictators appointed for specific emergencies, Sulla held the office to reform the state. He weakened the tribunate that had been used against senatorial interests, strengthened the Senate's control, codified procedures, and attempted to restore traditional oligarchic rule. Then, having established his system, he resigned his dictatorship in 79 BCE and retired to private life. He died the following year, perhaps thinking he had saved the Republic. He had not. The precedents of civil war, of armies marching on Rome, of proscriptions and political murder, could not be erased. The Republic's moral authority, the unwritten rules that made the system work, had been shattered. What followed was a generation of ambitious men using the Republic's forms to pursue personal power, until the forms themselves became meaningless and were discarded. Three men dominated the next generation: Pompey, Crassus, and Julius Caesar. Pompey, called the Great in imitation of Alexander, was a brilliant general who fought with Sulla, then suppressed rebellion in Spain, cleared the Mediterranean of pirates, and conquered vast territories in the east, from Syria to the Black Sea. He returned to Italy expecting the Senate to ratify his settlements and grant land to his veterans. When the Senate stalled, he entered an informal alliance with Crassus and Caesar. The so-called First Triumvirate. Crassus was Rome's richest man, a shrewd politician and businessman who had profited from Sulla's proscriptions and now sought military glory to match his wealth. Caesar was a patrician of questionable finances, an undeniable talent, a brilliant orator and skilled politician with ambitions that frightened the Senate. Together, the three men dominated Roman politics, dividing consulships and provinces among themselves, bypassing senatorial opposition through popular assemblies and tribunician legislation. Caesar became consul in 59 BCE and then took command of Gaul, that vast territory beyond the Alps that had threatened Rome centuries before. What followed was 8 years of war detailed in Caesar's own commentaries, written with deceptive simplicity that concealed their propaganda purpose. Caesar conquered all of Gaul, defeated Germanic tribes across the Rhine, even invaded Britain twice, though without permanent success. He enslaved perhaps 1 million people, killed perhaps another 1 million, and sent enormous wealth back to Rome. The conquest of Gaul made Caesar incredibly wealthy and gave him a loyal army, but it also alarmed the Senate and strained the triumvirate. Crassus sought equal glory by invading Parthia, the successor to the Persian Empire in the east. At Carrhae in 53 BCE, his army was destroyed by Parthian cavalry, using tactics of feigned retreat and mounted archery that the legions could not counter. Crassus was killed, possibly by having molten gold poured down his throat in mockery of his greed. His death removed the balance in the triumvirate. Pompey and Caesar, once allies through Pompey's marriage to Caesar's daughter Julia, drifted into rivalry after Julia's death in childbirth. The Senate, fearing Caesar's ambitions, allied with Pompey as the lesser threat. They demanded Caesar give up his command and return to Rome as a private citizen, knowing he faced prosecution for illegal acts during his consulship. Caesar demanded he be allowed to run for consul in absentia, maintaining the legal immunity of magistracy. Neither would compromise. In January 49 BCE, Caesar faced a choice: obey the Senate and face destruction, or march on Rome as Sulla had done and begin civil war. According to tradition, he hesitated at the Rubicon River, the boundary between his province and Italy proper, knowing that crossing with his army meant war. Then he said, "Alla iacta est." The die is cast and crossed. It was perhaps the most consequential river crossing in history. The civil war that followed was fought across the Mediterranean. Pompey, abandoning Italy, retreated to Greece to gather forces from Rome's eastern provinces. Caesar pursued, besieged Pompey at Dyrrhachium in an epic siege that nearly destroyed Caesar's army, then met Pompey at Pharsalus in Thessaly in 48 BCE. Despite being outnumbered, Caesar won decisively through superior tactics and his veteran skill. Pompey fled to Egypt, where the young pharaoh Ptolemy III had him murdered, hoping to curry favor with Caesar. Caesar arrived in Egypt to find his rival dead. He became entangled in a dynastic struggle between Ptolemy and his sister wife Cleopatra VII, the famous queen who would become Caesar's lover and bear his son. Caesar fought a small war in Alexandria, installing Cleopatra on the throne, then moved east to deal with Pharnaces, son of Mithridates. Caesar defeated him so quickly that he sent back the famous message, Veni, vidi, vici. I came, I saw, I conquered. The civil war continued as Pompey's sons and senatorial diehards fought on in Africa and Spain. Caesar defeated them at Thapsus in Africa in 46 BCE and Munda in Spain in 45 BCE. The latter was a desperate, close-run battle where Caesar himself had to rally his troops in person. But after Munda, organized resistance ceased. Caesar had won. He returned to Rome as undisputed master of the Roman world. What Caesar intended for Rome's future is debated. He accepted honors and titles, became dictator perpetuo, dictator for life, which violated all republican tradition. His image appeared on coins while he lived. Divine honors were decreed. He planned campaigns against Parthia to avenge Crassus and against the Dacians on the Danube frontier. He forgave many enemies, appointed them to offices, sought reconciliation, but he also showed contempt for republican forms, remaining seated when the Senate approached, behaving more like a king than a magistrate. Whether he intended to make himself king, we cannot know. On the Ides of March, the 15th day of March 44th BCE, a group of senators who called themselves liberators assassinated him in Pompey's theatre where the Senate was meeting. Led by Brutus and Cassius, men Caesar had forgiven and honored, they struck him down with daggers. Caesar fell at the base of Pompey's statue, bleeding from 23 wounds. According to later accounts, when he saw Brutus among the assassins, he said, "Kai su teknon," you too, child. In Greek, though this may be invention, the assassins thought they were saving the Republic. They had eliminated the tyrant. Now surely, Republican government would resume as if Caesar had never been. This was fantasy. The Republic had been dying for a generation. Its death had been decreed at the Rubicon, perhaps earlier, perhaps when Sulla marched on Rome, perhaps when the Gracchi were murdered, perhaps when Rome became an empire too large for city-state institutions to govern. What followed Caesar's assassination was not restoration, but more civil war, more brutal than before. Caesar's heir was his great-nephew Octavian, posthumously adopted in Caesar's will, an 18-year-old youth who seemed unthreatening. He would prove to be one of the most skilled politicians in history. Cunning where Caesar had been bold, patient where Caesar had been impulsive. Over the next 14 years, Octavian would eliminate all rivals and transform Rome from republic to empire, from chaos to stability, from civil war to the Pax Romana that would last 2 centuries. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let us pause here at Caesar's death and consider what has been lost. The Roman Republic, that extraordinary experiment in collective rule, had endured nearly 5 centuries. It had created a system of checks and balances, of laws rather than rulers, of citizenship rather than subjects. It had built an empire and absorbed Greek culture. It had produced remarkable achievements in law, engineering, military organization, and administration, but it had failed to adapt. The system designed for governing a city-state could not govern an empire. The unwritten rules that maintained order, broke down when men like Sulla and Caesar prioritized personal ambition over tradition. The social war had shown that Roman citizenship was valuable enough to fight for, but the Senate had resisted sharing it until forced. The Gracchi had shown that reform was necessary, but the Senate had killed reformers rather than compromise. The precedent of political violence, once established, could not be unestablished. In the end, the Republic died not from external conquest, but internal contradiction. It died because its citizens valued their own interests over collective welfare, because generals commanded loyal legions, because the spoils of empire created inequalities that couldn't be managed, because the system could not accommodate the ambitions it unleashed. The tragedy is that many who destroyed it loved it genuinely and thought they were saving it. The Republic was dead. Long live what? The question was answered not quickly, but gradually, over years of further warfare, until finally emerging in a form that preserved Republican language and forms while concentrating power in one man. Augustus, as Octavian would call himself, would claim to have restored the Republic. In a sense he had, by ending the civil wars. In another sense, he had merely buried it decently and built something new on its grave. The Augustan Golden Age, the birth of empire. The aftermath of Caesar's assassination was chaos. The assassins, having killed the dictator, had no plan for what came next. Marcus Antonius, Caesar's lieutenant and consul, seized Caesar's papers and funds. He inflamed the mob at Caesar's funeral with a famous speech, later immortalized by Shakespeare, though the actual words are unknown, turning popular opinion against the assassins. Brutus and Cassius fled to the east to gather forces. Then this teenage great-nephew appeared, calling himself Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, claiming Caesar's name through adoption, demanding recognition as Caesar's heir. Antony dismissed him contemptuously. Cicero, the great orator and senior statesman, thought Octavian could be used against Antony, then discarded, praised, raised and erased, as he privately joked. Both men underestimated the boy catastrophically. Octavian raised an army from Caesar's veterans, who remembered their general's generosity and hoped for similar treatment from his heir. He allied with the Senate against Antony, helped defeat Antony at Mutina, then promptly betrayed the Senate and allied with Antony and Lepidus, Caesar's former master of horse, forming the Second Triumvirate. Unlike the First Triumvirate, which was informal, this one was officially sanctioned, giving the three men dictatorial power to restore the Republic. What they restored was terror. The Second Triumvirate initiated new prescriptions, listing enemies whose lives and property were forfeit. Perhaps 300 senators and 2,000 equestrians died, including Cicero. The great orator tried to flee but was caught. His head and hands were cut off and displayed in the Forum, where Antony's wife Fulvia reportedly pulled out his tongue and stabbed it with her hairpin in revenge for his speeches against her husband. The prescriptions were partly political, eliminating opponents, partly financial, seizing wealth to pay armies. They were certainly bloody, a reminder that the Republic had died violently and would not be mourned gently. Brutus and Cassius had gathered forces in the east, claiming to defend the Republic against tyranny. In 42 BCE, Antony and Octavian met them at Philippi in Macedonia. 2 battles were fought. In the first, Brutus defeated Octavian's forces, while Antony defeated Cassius's. Cassius, hearing incorrectly that Brutus had lost, committed suicide. The second battle was decisive. Antony's forces crushed Brutus's army. Brutus also committed suicide, reportedly saying, "Wretched virtue, you were only a name, but I followed you as if you were real." With the liberators dead, the Republic's last defenders were gone. The triumvirs divided the empire. Antony took the wealthy east, Octavian got Italy and the west, Lepidus received Africa. Antony went to the east to raise funds and secure the frontier. In Egypt he met Cleopatra, who had been Caesar's lover and still ruled as queen. Antony became her lover and political ally, recognizing the twins she claimed were Caesar's children. planning an Eastern empire with Alexandria as its capital. He was repeating Alexander's synthesis of Greek and Eastern cultures, imagining Rome's future as Mediterranean empire with dual capitals, dual cultures, Eastern monarchy merged with Roman power. Octavian saw this as threat and opportunity. He consolidated power in Italy, fought a difficult war against Sextus Pompey, Pompey's surviving son who controlled Sicily and disrupted grain supplies. He sidelined Lepidus, accusing him of plotting and forcing him into retirement. He began propaganda against Antony, portraying him as corrupted by Eastern luxury, bewitched by Cleopatra, preparing to give Rome's empire to an Egyptian queen. The propaganda was effective, playing on Roman prejudices against monarchy and foreign influence. The final confrontation came in 31 BCE at Actium, off the western coast of Greece. It was officially a war against Cleopatra, not Antony. Octavian claimed to be rescuing Rome from foreign threat, not waging civil war against a fellow Roman. Antony's fleet and Cleopatra's were blockaded by Octavian's forces under Marcus Agrippa, Octavian's brilliant general and loyal friend. When battle came, Cleopatra broke through the blockade with her ships and fled. Antony followed her, abandoning his fleet, which surrendered. Octavian pursued to Egypt. Antony and Cleopatra committed suicide rather than face capture. Cleopatra's supposed method, death by asp bite, became legendary, though historians suggest poison was more likely. Their children were captured. Caesarion, the son Cleopatra claimed was Caesar's, was killed. Octavian could not allow a potential rival claiming descent from Caesar. The twins Cleopatra had with Antony were spared and raised by Octavian's sister Octavia, who had briefly been Antony's wife in a political marriage. Egypt, that ancient kingdom that had survived intact through all previous Mediterranean conflicts, was annexed not as a normal province, but as Octavian's personal property, governed by his appointed prefect, off limits to senators. Its grain would feed Rome. Its wealth would fund Octavian's projects. The last Hellenistic kingdom, the final remnant of Alexander's empire, was absorbed into Rome's. The ancient world of city-states and competing kingdoms was definitively over. One power now controlled the entire Mediterranean basin, Rome, and one man controlled Rome, Octavian. But how to exercise that control without Caesar's fate? Octavian had learned from his great-uncle's mistakes. Open monarchy would be rejected. Roman senators would not tolerate a king, but they might tolerate something that looked like restoration of the Republic, while actually being one-man rule. Over the years 27 to 23 BCE, Octavian constructed the political settlement called the Principate, from princeps, first citizen. In 27 BCE, he appeared before the Senate and announced he was restoring the Republic. He handed back all his emergency powers, gave the provinces to the Senate, declared his mission complete. It was political theatre. The Senate, grateful and terrified, immediately gave him back most of what he had surrendered, plus honors and a new name. Augustus, the revered one, a title with religious overtones. He kept the most important provinces with their legions, maintained tribunician power that let him veto anything, held imperium that gave him command over all armies, and controlled Rome's finances. But officially, he was just first among equals, the princeps. The genius was maintaining republican forms while draining them of power. The Senate still met, still debated, still appointed magistrates. But Augustus controlled military force, popular support through bread and circuses, enormous patronage networks, and practical control of succession through adoption. He held multiple offices simultaneously or consecutively, each technically legal, together giving him complete power. It was, in the words of historian Ronald Syme, the Caesarian party organized as a government. Augustus ruled for 41 years, from 27 BCE to 14 CE, transforming Rome from war-torn republic to stable empire. The civil wars ended. The legions, previously loyal to individual generals, became the emperor's forces, moved to frontiers rather than Italy. Paid and equipped from imperial funds, veterans settled in colonies across the empire. A permanent military force of perhaps 300,000 men held the frontiers against barbarians. Those frontiers were regularized, made defensible. In the east, Parthia was too strong to conquer, so Augustus made peace, recovering the standards lost by Crassus, presenting it as victory without the cost of war. In the west and north, expansion continued. Spain was finally pacified after 2 centuries of resistance. The Alpine tribes were conquered, connecting Italy to Gaul. The Danube became a frontier with provinces beyond. Germany seemed next until disaster struck. In 9 CE, Publius Quinctilius Varus, leading 3 legions through the Teutoburg forest in Germany, was ambushed by Germanic tribes under Arminius, a chieftain who had served in Roman forces and knew Roman tactics. The legions were destroyed, perhaps 20,000 men killed in the dense forest, unable to maintain formation, picked apart over 3 days of fighting. Varus committed suicide. The eagle standards, symbols of legion honor, were captured. Augustus was reportedly so distressed he let his hair and beard grow in mourning and would bang his head against walls shouting, "Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions." The disaster ended Roman expansion east of the Rhine. Germany beyond the river would remain free. The frontier stabilized at Rhine and Danube, and Augustus advised his successor not to expand further. The empire had reached its natural limits, defined by defensible frontiers, beyond which conquest cost more than it gained. It was advice born of pragmatism, and later generations would wonder if following it was wisdom or failure of nerve. Within the empire, Augustus brought order and prosperity. He divided provinces between imperial provinces, which he governed through legates, and senatorial provinces, governed by proconsuls appointed by the Senate. The system balanced, giving the Senate meaningful role while keeping strategic provinces under imperial control. He regularized taxation, ending the worst abuses of tax farming that had oppressed provinces. He built infrastructure, roads connecting the empire, aqueducts bringing water to cities, harbors facilitating trade. Rome itself was transformed. Augustus boasted he found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble. Temples were restored or rebuilt, forums constructed, theatres and baths created. The Arapacis, altar of peace, celebrated the end of civil wars. Agrippa built the Pantheon, the aqueducts, the public baths. Rome became a capital worthy of its empire, monumental architecture expressing imperial power and beneficence. Culture flourished in what is called the Augustan Age. Virgil wrote the Aeneid, Rome's national epic connecting Aeneas to Augustus through elaborate genealogy, justifying Roman imperialism as fated by gods. The poem was unfinished when Virgil died, and he requested it be burned, but Augustus ordered it published. It became Rome's defining literary work, required reading for educated Romans for centuries. Horace wrote odes celebrating peace and Roman values, lyrics of such skill they influenced European poetry for 2 millennia. Livy composed his massive history of Rome from its founding, 142 books chronicling the Republic's rise, most now lost but influential on Roman historical consciousness. Ovid's Metamorphoses gathered Greek and Roman myths into interconnected narratives, while his Art of Love scandalized moralists and delighted readers. Augustus, promoting traditional morality, eventually exiled Ovid to the Black Sea for a poem and a mistake. The poem being The Art of Love, the mistake unknown, but speculated to involve the emperor's wayward daughter Julia. Augustus promoted traditional religion and morality, restoring temples, reviving priesthoods, encouraging marriage and childbearing through legislation. His own family life was complicated. He divorced his first wife to marry Livia, who was herself married and pregnant. Livia brought sons from her previous marriage, Tiberius and Drusus, while Augustus had only one biological child, Julia, whose sexual scandals forced him to exile her. Augustus wanted to found a dynasty but lacked male heirs. He adopted Gaius and Lucius, his grandsons through Julia, grooming them for succession. Both died young. He reluctantly adopted Tiberius, Livia's elder son from her first marriage, making him heir. Augustus died in 14 CE, aged 75, after 41 years of rule. His last words were reportedly to ask if he had played his part in the comedy of life well. He had. The Principate he created would endure, with modifications, for nearly 3 centuries in the West, 15 centuries in the East. He had ended the civil wars, established stable government, brought prosperity, promoted culture, and created the framework for empire. Rome would call him Divus Augustus, Divine Augustus, and worship him as a god. Later emperors would claim his name as title, Caesar Augustus becoming simply Caesar and Augustus, 2 words meaning emperor. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace, had begun. For 2 centuries, the Mediterranean world would know relative peace, prosperity, and stability. Cities would flourish, trade would expand, culture would thrive. Bandits and pirates were suppressed. Wars were mostly on frontiers far from the urban centers. The empire's subjects could travel from Britain to Egypt, from Spain to Syria, speaking Latin or Greek, using Roman coins, protected by Roman law. It was an achievement of governance remarkable for any age, extraordinary for the ancient world. But the peace was built on military power, maintained by competent emperors and dependent on systems working as designed. When emperors were incompetent, when systems broke down, the peace would fracture. The next 2 centuries would see good emperors and terrible ones, expansion and crisis, golden ages and disasters. The story of the Roman Empire was far from over. It was, in many ways, just beginning. The High Empire, dynasties and dominance. The transfer of power from Augustus to Tiberius in 14 CE was the first test of the Principate's stability. Would the system work without its creator? Tiberius was experienced, having served as general and administrator, but he was also reluctant, possibly resentful, of being adopted only after Augustus's preferred heirs died. He was 55 years old, dour, suspicious, and uncomfortable with the public performance emperorship required. Tiberius's reign, lasting until 37 CE, was competent but increasingly dark. He maintained Augustus's policies, kept the frontiers secure, managed finances prudently, and avoided expensive wars. But his relationship with the Senate deteriorated. The treason trials multiplied as Tiberius saw conspiracies everywhere. The Praetorian Guard, the elite unit protecting the emperor, grew in power under its prefect Sejanus, who manipulated Tiberius and eliminated rivals until finally being arrested and executed for plotting against the emperor. Tiberius eventually withdrew to Capri, ruling from the island through correspondence, rarely appearing in Rome. Rumors spread of sexual depravities and cruelty, probably exaggerated by hostile sources but reflecting genuine unpopularity. When he died in 37 CE, possibly murdered by the next Praetorian prefect, few mourned. Yet his reign had been stable and solvent, preserving what Augustus built, even if Tiberius lacked Augustus's political skill. The succession passed to Gaius, nicknamed Caligula, Little Boot, from his childhood with the legions. He was Germanicus's son, grandson of Tiberius's brother Drusus, and great-great-grandson of Augustus through multiple lines. He began his reign with generosity and popular measures, but within months a serious illness transformed him. What emerged was either madness or tyranny so extreme it resembled madness. Caligula's behavior became increasingly erratic and cruel. He executed senators on whim, confiscated property to fund his spending, humiliated the aristocracy, and claimed divinity, demanding worship as a living god. The famous stories, making his horse a consul, building a bridge across the Bay of Naples to ride across it, may be exaggerations, but they captured contemporaries' view of a ruler unhinged. After less than 4 years, The Praetorian Guard assassinated him in January 41st CE. His wife and infant daughter were also killed, extinguishing his line. The Praetorians found Claudius, Caligula's uncle, hiding behind a curtain in the palace. Claudius was 50 years old, considered unfit for public life due to physical disabilities. He stuttered, drooled, had a limp that made him seem mentally deficient. But Claudius was intelligent, a scholar who had written histories of Etruria and Carthage. The Praetorians proclaimed him emperor, and the Senate, having no alternative, confirmed it. It was a crucial moment. The army had chosen an emperor, establishing a precedent that would echo through Roman history. Claudius's reign from 41 to 54 CE was surprisingly successful. He was an effective administrator, creating professional bureaucracies to manage the empire, relying on freedmen advisors which offended senatorial pride but improved efficiency. He oversaw the conquest of Britain, that island Julius Caesar had invaded but never held, personally visiting to claim credit. Britannia became a province, Rome's northernmost, requiring permanent garrison but adding territory and glory. Claudius was less successful in personal life. His third wife Messalina was notoriously promiscuous and plotted to replace him, forcing Claudius to have her executed. His fourth wife Agrippina the Younger, his own niece, manipulated him into adopting her son Nero and making him heir over Claudius's biological son Britannicus. When Claudius died in 54 CE, possibly poisoned by Agrippina with toxic mushrooms, Nero succeeded at age 16. Nero's reign began well under the guidance of the philosopher Seneca and the Praetorian prefect Burrus. The first 5 years, the Quinquennium Neronis, were remembered as good government. But Nero's character darkened. He murdered his mother Agrippina when she opposed him, killed his wife Octavia to marry Poppaea Sabina, and became increasingly paranoid and cruel. He fancied himself an artist, performing publicly as singer and actor, which Romans considered undignified for an emperor. His private life was scandalous by Roman standards. In 64 CE, a great fire destroyed much of Rome. Rumors spread that Nero had started it to clear land for his golden palace, the Domus Aurea. Nero blamed Christians, a small sect considered subversive, initiating the first persecution. According to tradition, both Peter and Paul were executed during these persecutions. Peter crucified upside down, Paul beheaded as befitted a Roman citizen. Nero's reputation never recovered from the fire, whether or not he was responsible. When Gaius Julius Vindex, governor of Gaul, rebelled in 68 CE, followed by Galba in Spain, Nero's support collapsed. The Senate declared him a public enemy. Abandoned by everyone, Nero fled Rome and committed suicide, reportedly saying, "What an artist dies in me." His death ended the Julio-Claudian dynasty, Augustus's bloodline extinct. The question of succession, unresolved since Augustus avoided the word king, erupted into civil war. The year of the four emperors, 68-69 CE, saw 4 men proclaimed emperor in quick succession. Galba, an elderly senator and general, was proclaimed by his legions, but alienated support through severity and failing to pay promised donatives. The Praetorians murdered him after 7 months, elevating Otho, a senator who had supported him. But the Rhine legions had proclaimed their commander Vitellius emperor. Otho's forces were defeated, and Otho committed suicide after 3 months. Vitellius seemed secure, but the Eastern legions, the most numerous and recently victorious in the Jewish war, proclaimed their commander Vespasian. After months of maneuvering, Vespasian's forces captured Rome, killing Vitellius in street fighting. The civil war was over, but it had revealed the Principate's vulnerability. As the historian Tacitus wrote, the secret of empire was revealed. Emperors could be made elsewhere than in Rome. Military force, not birth or constitutional principle, determined succession. Vespasian, from a non-aristocratic family, ruled from 69 to 79 CE as the first of the Flavian dynasty. He was practical, blunt, and effective, restoring finances exhausted by Nero's extravagance and civil war. His most visible monument was the Flavian Amphitheatre, known to us as the Colosseum, built on the site of Nero's palace lake, symbolically returning to the people what Nero had taken. The great arena where gladiators fought and public spectacles were held became Rome's most iconic building. Vespasian's elder son Titus succeeded him in 79 CE. Titus's reign was brief, only 2 years, but marked by disaster and imperial generosity. Mount Vesuvius erupted in August 79 CE, burying Pompeii and Herculaneum under ash and lava, killing thousands. The preserved cities would give future archaeologists extraordinary insight into Roman daily life. But for contemporaries, it was tragedy. Titus sent aid and visited the region personally. When a fire and plague struck Rome, he again responded generously. He died in 81 CE, mourned as the delight of the human race for his kindness. Titus's brother Domitian ruled from 81 to 96 CE. He was an effective administrator and general, securing the Rhine and Danube frontiers, but his relationship with the Senate was hostile. Domitian saw himself as master, calling himself Dominus et Deus, Lord and God, demanding the respect denied him as Vespasian's second son. He initiated another round of treason trials. The executions included senators and even his cousin Flavius Clemens and niece Domitilla, possibly for Christian sympathies. When the terror extended to the palace itself, courtiers conspired with the Praetorian Guard to assassinate him in September 96 CE. The Senate selected one of their own, the elderly Marcus Cocceius Nerva, to succeed. Nerva's brief reign, 96-98 CE, established a new succession principle that would serve Rome well. Having no children, Nerva adopted as his son and heir Marcus Ulpius Traianus, Trajan, a successful general commanding the Rhine legions. The adoption satisfied the military while maintaining senatorial prerogative. More importantly, it established merit, not birth, as the criterion for succession. This began the era of the 5 good emperors, a period from 96 to 180 CE of stable succession and good government, recognized even by later Christian writers hostile to pagan Rome as a golden age. Each emperor adopted his successor based on ability, creating a meritocratic dynasty without dynastic succession's usual problems. Trajan, reigning from 98 to 117 CE, was Rome's first provincial emperor, born in Spain. He was also Rome's most successful military emperor since Augustus, conquering Dacia, modern Romania, in 2 wars, annexing it as a province and extracting its gold and silver mines. His victory was celebrated with Trajan's Column in Rome, its spiral relief depicting the Dacian Wars in detailed propaganda. More controversially, he invaded Parthia, conquering Armenia and Mesopotamia, reaching the Persian Gulf. Rome had never been larger, stretching from Britain to Mesopotamia, from the Rhine to the Sahara. But the Parthian conquests could not be held. Revolts erupted across Mesopotamia and Judea. Trajan fell ill and died returning to Rome in 117 CE. His adopted son Hadrian immediately abandoned the eastern conquests, consolidating frontiers at defensible lines. Hadrian, ruling from 117 to 138 CE, was a different sort of emperor. He travelled extensively, visiting every province, inspecting troops, promoting construction. In Britain, he built Hadrian's Wall, 73 miles of fortification from coast to coast, marking the empire's northern limit. It was a statement that empire had limits, that consolidation mattered more than expansion. Hadrian was cultured, intellectual, fascinated by Greek culture. He rebuilt the Pantheon in Rome, creating the magnificent dome structure that survives today. His relationship with a Greek youth named Antinous was so intense that when Antinous drowned in the Nile, Hadrian had him deified and founded a city in his honor. Romans were accustomed to same-sex relationships, but the intensity of Hadrian's grief and deification of his lover was unusual and attracted comment. Hadrian's suppression of the Bar Kokhba revolt in Judea from 132 to 136 CE was brutal. The rebellion, led by Simon Bar Kokhba, whom some Jews proclaimed as Messiah, was sparked by Hadrian's plan to build a Roman colony on Jerusalem's ruins and ban circumcision. After years of bitter fighting, Roman forces crushed the revolt. Hundreds of thousands of Jews died or were enslaved. Judea was renamed Syria Palestina to erase Jewish connection to the land. Jerusalem became Aelia Capitolina, a Roman city forbidden to Jews. The diaspora accelerated, Judaism transforming from a temple-based religion to one centered on synagogues and rabbinical interpretation of Torah. Hadrian adopted Antoninus Pius, who ruled peacefully from 138 to 161 CE. His reign was so quiet that historians struggle to find much to say about it, which is perhaps the highest praise for a ruler. The empire was prosperous and stable. The frontiers were secure. No major wars or crises disrupted the peace. Antoninus was called pious, dutiful for his piety and devotion to Hadrian's memory. He built the Antonine Wall in Britain, north of Hadrian's Wall, though it was soon abandoned. Antoninus's adopted son, Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, ruled from 161 to 180 CE. He was a Stoic philosopher whose meditations, written in Greek while on campaign, survive as one of antiquity's most moving texts. He did not want to be emperor, would have preferred the life of philosophical contemplation, but duty called. His reign was marked by constant warfare, against Parthia in the east, against Germanic tribes on the Danube, where he died in camp in 180 CE. Marcus faced additional challenges, a devastating plague, possibly smallpox, brought back from the east by returning legions, which killed millions across the empire, economic strain from constant warfare, and the growing pressure on the frontiers as barbarian tribes pressed against Rome's borders. Despite these challenges, Marcus remained dutiful, living according to Stoic principles of virtue and endurance. His meditations remind himself to bear misfortune patiently, to do his duty without complaint, to recognize that his power is temporary but his character eternal. Marcus made one crucial mistake. He broke the adoptive succession system by making his biological son Commodus his heir. Commodus, who ruled from 180 to 192 CE, was everything his father was not. Where Marcus was dutiful and philosophical, Commodus was self-indulgent and theatrical. He fought as a gladiator in the arena, something no emperor had done, considering himself a new Hercules. He renamed Rome and its institutions after himself. His rule became increasingly erratic and cruel, climaxing in a conspiracy of palace officials, including his favorite concubine, who had him strangled by a wrestler on the last day of 192 CE. Commodus's death ended the Antonine dynasty and the golden age it represented. The year 193 CE saw another civil war as multiple generals were proclaimed emperor by their legions. Septimius Severus, commanding the Danubian legions, prevailed after defeating his rivals and marched into Rome. The Severan dynasty would rule until 235 CE, but something had changed. The military character of the Principate was now undeniable. Severus famously advised his sons, "Enrich the soldiers and despise everyone else." The emperor's power rested on the army's support, and the army's support had to be purchased. The High Empire, the period of Roman dominance and prosperity, was ending. The systems Augustus had created still functioned, but they were showing strain. The frontiers were under constant pressure. The economy struggled with debased coinage and military expenses. The plague had disrupted trade and population, and the precedent of military force determining succession had been re-established. The 3rd century would bring crisis that nearly destroyed the empire, requiring fundamental transformation to survive. But before we turn to crisis, let us pause to consider what the High Empire achieved. At its peak in the mid-2nd century CE, the Roman Empire was the most successful political organization the Western world had yet produced. Perhaps 60 million people lived under Roman rule, speaking hundreds of languages but united by Roman law, Roman military protection, and increasingly shared culture. Cities flourished across the empire, connected by roads and sea routes. Trade flowed from Britain to India, silk from China, spices from Arabia, grain from Egypt, olive oil from Spain, wine from Gaul. Roman engineering provided infrastructure that survived centuries. Roads still forming the basis of European routes, aqueducts still standing in Spain and France and North Africa, bridges still carrying traffic. The Pantheon's dome, still the largest unreinforced concrete dome in existence. Roman law provided framework for property, contracts, citizenship that influenced legal systems ever since. Latin spread across the Western Empire, evolving into Romance languages, Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Romanian, that millions speak today. The empire was not perfect. It was built on slavery, though the institution was less brutal than New World slavery, with slaves often able to buy freedom or being freed by masters and becoming citizens. Women had no political rights, though wealthy women could exert influence and own property. The poor in cities lived in squalid conditions, their lives made tolerable only by subsidized bread and public entertainments. Provincial populations were exploited for tax revenue and resources. Conquest had created the empire through violence, and violence maintained it. Yet within those limits, the empire provided stability and prosperity, remarkable for any pre-modern society. A merchant could travel from Britain to Egypt with reasonable safety, using the same currency, protected by the same laws. A philosopher in Athens could correspond with colleagues in Rome and Alexandria. A soldier from Syria could retire on the Rhine with a pension. The Mediterranean became a Roman lake, its coasts united for the first time, and only time in history, under one government. This was the achievement of the High Empire, and it was extraordinary. Crisis and transformation, the 3rd century. The 3rd century CE is often called the crisis of the 3rd century, and the name is apt. For 50 years, from 235 to 284 CE, the Roman Empire nearly collapsed. The problems were multiple and mutually reinforcing. Military pressure on multiple frontiers, civil wars as generals fought for the throne, economic breakdown as currency was debased and trade disrupted, plague epidemics that killed millions, and loss of confidence in the empire's institutions. The Severan dynasty, which had seemed to stabilize the empire after Commodus's chaos, ended in 235 CE with the murder of Severus Alexander by his own troops. What followed was the era of the barracks emperors, military commanders proclaimed by their legions, most reigning briefly before being killed by rivals or their own soldiers. Between 235 and 284 CE, there were more than 50 claimants to the throne, most ruling only a few years or even months. This instability had catastrophic effects. With emperors focused on fighting rivals, frontiers were neglected. Germanic tribes, Goths, Alemanni, Franks, broke through the Rhine and Danube frontiers, raiding deep into the empire. In the east, the Sassanid Persian Empire, successor to the Parthians, was more aggressive and better organized than its predecessor. The Sassanids captured the Emperor Valerian in 260 CE, the first and only time a Roman emperor was captured by foreign enemies. Valerian spent his remaining years in captivity, reportedly used as a footstool by the Persian king Shapur III, then flayed after death with his skin stuffed and displayed as trophy. The economy spiraled into crisis. To pay their armies, emperors debased the coinage, reducing silver content in coins until the denarius was barely silver at all. This caused inflation as people recognized coins were worth less. Trade declined as merchants lost confidence in currency. Cities contracted as economic basis weakened. The plague, possibly the same as the Antonine Plague or a different epidemic, returned in waves, depopulating cities and disrupting agriculture. Parts of the empire broke away. In 260 CE, Postumus, commanding the Rhine legions, proclaimed himself emperor of a Gallic empire that included Gaul, Britain, and Spain. This breakaway empire lasted until 274 CE, with its own emperors, coins, and administration. In the east, Palmyra, an oasis city in Syria, under its queen Zenobia, became effectively independent, controlling Syria, Egypt, and parts of Asia Minor. Both regions claimed loyalty to Rome but acted independently, responding to frontier threats the central government could not address. The crisis produced interesting responses. The Emperor Aurelian, ruling from 270 to 275 CE, earned the title Restorer of the World by defeating the Palmyrene Empire, reconquering the Gallic Empire, and driving back Germanic invasions. But he also built walls around Rome itself, the first since Republican times, acknowledging that Italy was no longer safe from invasion. Cities across the empire built walls, sacrificing suburbs for defensible cause. The empire was contracting, defending what could be defended. Military reforms were necessary. The legions, stationed in fixed frontier positions, couldn't respond quickly to breaches. A new mobile field army was needed that could march to threats wherever they arose. The cavalry became more important, able to move faster than infantry. The army increasingly recruited barbarians, Germanic warriors, who brought their own fighting styles and loyalties. The Roman army was becoming less Roman, a multinational force held together by pay and Roman officers. Culturally, the crisis produced anxiety and religious searching. Traditional Roman religion, focused on civic cults and ceremonial correctness, seemed inadequate to explain or prevent catastrophe. Eastern mystery religions promising salvation and personal relationship with deity attracted followers. Christianity, despite or perhaps because of periodic persecution, grew steadily. The religion offered community, moral framework, and promise of eternal life that traditional paganism did not. By the mid-3rd century, Christian communities existed in most cities, organized into a church hierarchy that would survive, even if the empire did not. Philosophy too responded to crisis. Neoplatonism, developed by Plotinus in Rome in the mid-3rd century, offered a systematic metaphysics that reconciled Plato's philosophy with religious yearning. Plotinus taught that reality emanated from a transcendent one, that the material world was imperfect reflection of higher reality, that the soul could through contemplation ascend to union with the One. It was philosophical mysticism, satisfying intellectual and spiritual needs simultaneously. Neoplatonism would influence Christian theology profoundly, providing philosophical vocabulary for articulating Christian doctrine. The crisis also produced legal developments. The Severan period had seen issuance of the Constitutio Antoniniana in 212 CE by Caracalla, granting Roman citizenship to all free inhabitants of the empire. This was partly fiscal. Citizens paid inheritance taxes, non-citizens did not. But it was also recognition that Roman identity had expanded beyond Italy. Anyone, regardless of ethnicity or language, could be Roman if they lived in the empire and participated in its culture. This universalism would allow the empire to survive crisis by being flexible about what Roman meant. By the 280 CE, the empire had survived. Barely. It was still intact, still defended the frontiers, still collected taxes and maintained basic order. But it was exhausted, transformed, no longer the confident civilization of the high empire. It needed someone to fundamentally reform its institutions, to adapt them to the changed reality of constant warfare, economic strain, and military determination of power. That someone was Diocletian, and what he created was different enough that historians debate whether it was still the same empire or something new. The Dominate. Diocletian and Constantine Diocletian became emperor in 284 CE through the typical 3rd century method. He was acclaimed by his troops after the previous emperor died under mysterious circumstances. But Diocletian was no ordinary barracks emperor. He ruled for 21 years, voluntarily retired, and lived in peaceful retirement for another 9. More importantly, he fundamentally restructured the empire, creating a system that would endure with modifications for 2 more centuries in the West and over a millennium in the East. Diocletian's diagnosis of the empire's problem was that it was too large for one man to govern and defend. The solution was tetrarchy, rule by 4. Diocletian appointed a co-emperor, Maximian, to govern the West while he governed the East. Each emperor then appointed a junior emperor, called Caesar, who would eventually succeed them. Diocletian's Caesar was Galerius, Maximian's was Constantius. The 4 emperors stationed themselves at strategic locations, not Rome, which was no longer militarily significant, and dealt with threats in their regions. The system worked surprisingly well during Diocletian's lifetime. The 4 emperors cooperated, defeating usurpers, repelling barbarians, and restoring stability. Britain, which had been held by a breakaway regime, was reconquered. The Persians were fought to a standstill. The frontiers were secured. Internally, Diocletian implemented sweeping reforms that transformed how the empire functioned. The provincial system was reorganized. Provinces were made smaller and more numerous, grouped into dioceses governed by vicari, who reported to the praetorian prefects, who reported to the emperors. This created more levels of bureaucracy, but also better control and more rapid response to problems. The army was enlarged and reorganized into frontier forces and mobile field armies. The tax system was reformed, with censuses and assessments designed to make taxation more predictable and harder to evade. Economically, Diocletian attempted to control inflation through his price edict of 301 CE, which set maximum prices for goods and services throughout the empire. The edict, inscribed on stone throughout the empire, provides modern historians with extraordinary detail about prices and wages, but probably failed in practice. Price controls rarely work because they don't address underlying causes of inflation. Nevertheless, the attempt showed Diocletian's systematic approach to problems. Diocletian also transformed the nature of emperorship itself. The Principate's fiction that the emperor was merely first citizen was abandoned. Diocletian styled himself Dominus, Lord, and insisted on Oriental court ceremony. Subjects prostrated themselves, kissed the hem of the emperor's robe, addressed him with elaborate titles. He wore jeweled robes and a diadem, looking more like a Persian king than a Roman magistrate. This was the Dominate, named from Dominus, where the emperor was openly acknowledged as absolute monarch. The transformation extended to religion. Diocletian promoted worship of Jupiter and Hercules as divine patrons of the emperors, attempting to unify the empire through common religious observance. This made Christianity, which refused to worship the emperor or traditional gods, a political problem. In 303 CE, Diocletian initiated the Great Persecution, ordering destruction of churches, burning of scriptures, and execution of Christians who refused to sacrifice to traditional gods. The persecution was the most severe yet. In the eastern provinces, where Diocletian and Galerius enforced it vigorously, thousands died. In the west, where Maximian and especially Constantius were less enthusiastic, enforcement was lighter. The persecution created many martyrs, whose deaths were recorded and celebrated by later Christians. But it failed in its purpose. Christianity was too widespread, too organized, too deeply rooted to be destroyed by force. When Galerius lay dying in 311 CE, he issued an edict of toleration, effectively admitting failure. Diocletian abdicated in 305 CE, forcing Maximian to do likewise, hoping the succession system would work. It did not. The Caesars succeeded as planned, but the new appointments to Caesar positions were disputed. Constantius's son Constantine, though illegitimate by Roman law since Constantius had divorced his mother to make a political marriage, was proclaimed emperor by his father's troops when Constantius died in 306 CE in Britain. Maxentius, Maximian's son who had been passed over, seized Rome. The tetrarchy collapsed into civil war among multiple claimants. Constantine would spend the next 18 years fighting his way to sole rule. The defining moment came in 312 CE when he marched on Rome against Maxentius. According to later Christian sources, Constantine had a vision before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, a cross in the sky with the words, "In this sign, conquer." Whether the vision happened, Constantine certainly adopted Christian symbols for his troops. He won decisively, Maxentius drowning in the Tiber during the battle. Constantine attributed his victory to the Christian God. The following year, Constantine and Licinius, who controlled the eastern provinces, met at Milan and issued what is known as the Edict of Milan, though it was actually a letter to provincial governors. The edict granted religious freedom to all, returning confiscated Christian property and effectively making Christianity legal. It was not yet the state religion, but imperial favor had shifted dramatically. Constantine spent the next decade eliminating Licinius, finally defeating him in 324 CE to become sole emperor. He ruled until 337 CE, transforming the empire religiously, culturally, and politically. His conversion to Christianity, whether sincere from the beginning or gradual, had enormous consequences. Christianity went from persecuted minority to favored religion. Constantine built churches, granted privileges to clergy, involved himself in theological disputes. When the Arian controversy threatened to split the church, Arius' teaching that Christ was created by God the Father and therefore subordinate, Orthodox Christians insisting Christ was co-eternal with the Father. Constantine convened the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE to settle the matter. The council, the first ecumenical church council, brought bishops from across the empire to debate theology. Constantine presided, seeking unity, even though he probably didn't fully understand the theological subtleties. The council condemned Arianism and produced the Nicene Creed, still recited in Christian churches today, affirming Christ's co-equality with the Father. But Arianism survived, especially among the Germanic peoples being converted to Christianity, and the controversy continued for decades. Constantine's other great decision was founding a new capital. Rome, for all its prestige, was poorly located for governing the empire's most threatened frontiers on the Rhine, Danube, and eastern borders. In 324 CE, Constantine chose Byzantium, a Greek city on the Bosporus Strait between Europe and Asia, and rebuilt it as Constantinople, Constantine's city. Inaugurated in 330 CE, Constantinople was designed as a Christian capital, filled with churches rather than pagan temples, though it retained traditional Roman civic institutions like circus and forum. The founding of Constantinople had profound long-term implications. The empire's center of gravity shifted east to the wealthier, more urbanized, more defensible eastern provinces. The west, increasingly peripheral, would face the full brunt of Germanic migrations with fewer resources. Constantinople would outlive Rome as an imperial capital by over 1,000 years, continuing until 1453 CE as capital of what we call the Byzantine Empire, but what its inhabitants always called the Roman Empire. Constantine died in 337 CE, having been baptized on his deathbed, a common practice since baptism was thought to wash away sins, so delaying it until death meant dying without new sins. He divided the empire among his 3 sons and 2 nephews, but this arrangement immediately collapsed into murder and civil war. Constantine II died fighting his brother Constans. Constans was assassinated. Constantius II, the surviving brother, eliminated the nephews except for Julian. Eventually, Constantius ruled alone, continuing his father's Christianization policies. Julian, raised Christian but secretly drawn to pagan philosophy, became Caesar and proved an effective general on the Rhine frontier. When Constantius died in 361 CE, Julian became sole emperor and revealed his true beliefs. He attempted to restore paganism, reopening temples, ending Christian privileges, writing against Christianity. His brief reign from 361 to 363 CE is known as the Julian the Apostate period by Christian sources. But Julian's restoration failed. Christianity was too established, and Julian died fighting the Persians in 363 CE, reportedly saying as he died, "You have won, Galilean," meaning Christ, though this is probably Christian invention. The remainder of the 4th century saw Christianity's final triumph. Emperor Theodosius III, ruling from 379 to 395 CE, made Nicene Christianity the official state religion, banned pagan worship, closed temples, and ended the Olympic Games as pagan festival. The transformation was complete. The Roman Empire was now officially Christian. Persecution reversed with pagans now pressured to convert. The altar of victory was removed from the Senate house in Rome, despite protests from pagan senators. Classical paganism would survive in rural areas. Pagan comes from paganus, meaning rural dweller, and among some aristocrats, but it was no longer the empire's official religion. Theodosius was also the last emperor to rule the entire empire. When he died in 395 CE, he divided it between his 2 sons. Arcadius received the east, Honorius the west. The division was intended as administrative, not permanent. Previous divisions had been temporary, but this one would prove lasting. The eastern and western halves would develop separately, facing different challenges, and eventually diverging into distinct civilizations. The Roman Empire was becoming 2 empires, though neither yet recognized it. The Western Empire's twilight. The 5th century in the West was a long decline punctuated by catastrophes, a civilization slowly dissolving as barbarian peoples moved into its territories, sometimes violently, sometimes peacefully, ultimately transforming it into something no longer recognizably Roman. The process was gradual enough that contemporaries did not always realize they were witnessing the end of an empire. They thought they were experiencing another crisis that would, like previous crises, be overcome. But this time was different. The fundamental problem was demographic and military. The Western Empire's population was declining, whether from plague, economic stress, or lower birth rates. Meanwhile, pressure on the frontiers intensified as Germanic and other peoples migrated westward, pushed by movements further east, particularly the Huns, nomadic warriors from the Asian steppes whose mobility and composite bows made them terrifying opponents. The empire needed soldiers to defend the frontiers, but it lacked the population to recruit them in sufficient numbers from Roman citizens. The solution had been to recruit barbarians, settling Germanic tribes within the empire as foederati, federated allies, who would defend Roman territory in exchange for land and payments. These groups retained their own chiefs, customs, and military organization, while theoretically serving Roman interests. It was pragmatic but dangerous. The foederati were not Romans, felt no deep loyalty to Roman institutions, and increasingly saw themselves as equals negotiating with a weakening empire rather than subjects obeying commands. The year 395 CE found the Western Empire nominally ruled by Honorius, Theodosius's 11-year-old son. Real power lay with Stilicho, a general of Vandal ancestry who served as regent. Stilicho was capable, defending Italy against various threats, but he faced impossible challenges. The Visigoths, a Gothic people who had been settled in the Balkans after fleeing the Huns, rebelled under their king Alaric. Stilicho negotiated with Alaric, settled him again, fought him when negotiations failed, but never decisively defeated him because he needed troops elsewhere. On the last day of 406 CE, a coalition of Germanic peoples, Vandals, Alans, Suevi, crossed the frozen Rhine River into Gaul. It was not an invasion in the traditional sense, but a migration of entire peoples seeking refuge from the Huns and better lands. The Rhine frontier, Rome's boundary for 4 centuries, collapsed. Gaul was overrun. The migrants kept moving through Gaul into Spain, searching for somewhere to settle. The Western imperial government, based in Ravenna rather than Rome because Ravenna's marshes made it more defensible, could not stop them. Britain, the empire's most distant province, was abandoned. In 410 CE, facing barbarian raids and unable to get help from the overstretched imperial army, the Romano-British were told by Honorius to look to their own defences. It was an admission that the empire could no longer protect them. Over the following decades, Germanic peoples, Angles, Saxons, Jutes, migrated to Britain, and Roman civilization there gradually disappeared, leaving only traces in language and ruins. In 408 CE, Stilicho was arrested on dubious charges of plotting with Alaric and executed. It was a catastrophic mistake driven by court intrigue and anti-barbarian sentiment. With Stilicho dead, there was no competent military leader to defend Italy. Alaric marched on Rome itself, besieging the ancient capital. When the city refused to meet his demands for payment and recognition, Alaric's Visigoths sacked Rome in August 410 CE. The sack of Rome was more restrained than it might have been. Alaric was Christian and ordered churches respected, but it was still traumatic. Rome had not been captured by foreign enemies in 8 centuries, not since the Gauls in 390 BCE. The psychological impact was immense. In far-off Bethlehem, Saint Jerome wrote that the city which had taken the whole world was itself taken. Pagans blamed Christianity for weakening Roman martial virtue. Christians like Augustine of Hippo wrote works like City of God explaining that earthly cities rise and fall, but the heavenly city is eternal, shifting Christian focus from preserving earthly empire to preparing for the kingdom of God. Alaric died soon after the sack, and the Visigoths, still searching for permanent settlement, were eventually directed to southwestern Gaul and Spain, where they established the Visigothic kingdom. Other barbarian groups were establishing their own kingdoms within former Roman territory. The Vandals crossed to North Africa, conquered the wealthy provinces there, and established a kingdom centered on Carthage. The Burgundians settled in the Rhone Valley. The Franks expanded in northern Gaul. The Suevi controlled part of Spain. These were not barbarian conquests in the sense of destroying Roman civilization. The barbarian kings ruled over largely Roman populations, preserved Roman law for their Roman subjects, minted coins in the emperor's name, often held Roman titles. They saw themselves as working within the Roman system, not destroying it. But the Western emperor's authority became increasingly fictional. He might grant titles and recognition to barbarian kings, but he did not control them. The empire briefly seemed to recover under the general Aetius, who dominated Western politics from the 430s to 450s. Aetius, who had lived among the Huns as hostage in his youth and understood barbarian warfare, played different groups against each other, maintaining some Roman authority through diplomacy and selective military action. His greatest achievement was defeating Attila the Hun. Attila, who ruled the Hunnic Empire from 434 to 453 CE, was one of history's great conquerors. He controlled territory from the Rhine to the Caspian Sea, extracting tribute from the Eastern Empire, inspiring terror across Europe. When he invaded Gaul in 451 CE, Aetius assembled a coalition of Romans and Germanic foederati, including the Visigoths, and met Attila at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains. The battle was massive, possibly involving hundreds of thousands of soldiers, and ended indecisively, but with Attila withdrawing from Gaul. The following year, 452 CE, Attila invaded Italy. He sacked several cities, including Aquileia, so thoroughly that survivors supposedly founded Venice on lagoon islands where his horsemen couldn't follow. He marched toward Rome, but Pope Leo I met him and negotiated his withdrawal. Whether the Pope's persuasion or plague in Attila's army or fear of the fate of Alaric, who had died shortly after sacking Rome, motivated the withdrawal is unclear. Attila retired beyond the Danube and died the next year, his empire collapsing in civil war among his sons. But Aetius's success earned him only execution. In 454 CE, the Emperor Valentinian III, jealous of Aetius's power and goaded by courtiers, personally stabbed Aetius to death during an audience. It was said that Valentinian had cut off his right hand with his left. The following year, Valentinian himself was assassinated by Aetius's former soldiers. The Western Empire was now completely adrift. The Vandals, under King Gaiseric, sailed from North Africa and sacked Rome in 455 CE. This sack was more thorough than Alaric's. The word vandalism comes from this event, but that's somewhat unfair since organized looting of enemy cities was standard practice. The Vandals took enormous plunder, including supposedly the treasures from the Jewish temple that Titus had brought from Jerusalem 4 centuries earlier, carrying them back to Carthage. The final decades of the Western Empire were a procession of shadow emperors, controlled by Germanic generals who held real power. Ritimer, a general of Gothic and Suevic ancestry, made and unmade emperors for nearly 20 years. The Eastern Empire occasionally intervened, trying to assert authority, but generally focused on its own problems. The last Western emperors were teenagers or children, puppets who commanded no loyalty and controlled no territory beyond Italy, if that. The end, when it came, was anticlimactic. In 476 CE, a Germanic general named Odoacer, commanding the few remaining troops in Italy, deposed the last Western emperor, a boy with the ironically grand name Romulus Augustulus. Little Romulus, little Augustus. Odoacer sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople, declaring that one emperor was sufficient and that he would rule Italy as the Eastern emperor's representative. The Eastern Emperor Zeno granted Odoacer recognition, though also supporting a rival Gothic leader, Theodoric. Historians traditionally mark 476 CE as the fall of the Roman Empire, but it was not recognized as such at the time. There was no dramatic destruction, no sense that an era had ended. Odoacer's coup was just another in a long series. The Senate continued to meet in Rome. Roman law continued to govern. Latin continued to be spoken. People still considered themselves Romans living in the Roman Empire, even if the emperor was far away in Constantinople, and local authority rested with Germanic kings. What had changed was that the Western Empire no longer existed as an independent political entity. The Mediterranean unity that had characterized the Roman world was broken. North Africa was controlled by the Vandals, Gaul by Franks and Burgundians and Visigoths, Spain by Visigoths and Suevi, Britain by Angles and Saxons. Italy itself was ruled by Odoacer until Theodoric the Ostrogoth conquered it in the 490s, establishing the Ostrogothic kingdom. The transformation from Roman Empire to barbarian kingdoms happened gradually. The Germanic kings initially maintained Roman administrative structures, employed Roman advisors, preserved Roman culture. Theodoric's kingdom in Italy was effectively Roman in most ways, with Theodoric respecting the Senate, maintaining public works, and patronizing culture. Boethius, the philosopher who served Theodoric, wrote The Consolation of Philosophy in prison before his execution, creating one of the medieval world's most influential texts, synthesizing classical philosophy with Christian theology. But over generations, the distinction between Romans and Germans blurred. Intermarriage occurred. Latin evolved into Romance languages. Germanic law mixed with Roman law. Christianity, which both groups shared, became the primary identity marker. The classical world of Greco-Roman culture, urban civilization, and Mediterranean unity was giving way to the medieval world of feudalism, rural economy, and Latin Christendom divided into kingdoms. The Western Empire did not fall in a day or year, or even a generation. It transformed, evolved, fragmented, was repurposed by new peoples who preserved some elements and discarded others. The process was not the catastrophe later generations imagined, the fall from light into darkness. It was a transition, often violent and disruptive, but also creative, producing new forms of organization, new cultures, new possibilities. Medieval European civilization was not simply collapsed Roman civilization, but something new built from Roman foundations by Germanic peoples who had themselves been transformed by contact with Rome. The Eastern Empire's continuation. The Byzantine millennium. While the West fragmented, the East endured. The Eastern Roman Empire, which we call Byzantine, though its inhabitants always called themselves Romans, continued for another 1,000 years after 476 CE. Constantinople, protected by massive walls, controlling wealthy provinces, connected to trade routes extending to India and China, proved far more resilient than the West. The reasons for Eastern survival were multiple. The eastern provinces were wealthier, more urbanized, more densely populated. They had been less affected by Germanic migrations and barbarian settlements. The frontier with Persia was stable compared to the West's collapsing Rhine-Danube frontier. Constantinople's position on the Bosporus made it easily defensible and hard to besiege. The Eastern emperors had maintained stronger control over their armies and avoided the cycle of barbarian generals controlling puppet emperors that destroyed the West. The greatest Eastern emperor was Justinian, who ruled from 527 to 565 CE. Justinian dreamed of restoring the Roman Empire to its former extent, reconquering the barbarian kingdoms that had taken Western provinces. His general Belisarius, one of history's great commanders despite limited resources, conquered the Vandal kingdom in North Africa in a lightning campaign in 533–534 CE. Belisarius then invaded Italy, beginning a long, devastating war against the Ostrogoths that lasted until 554 CE and left Italy depopulated and ruined, but nominally restored to Roman rule. Justinian's forces also conquered part of Spain from the Visigoths, establishing a foothold that lasted decades. At its greatest extent under Justinian, the empire once again controlled the Mediterranean's southern and eastern coasts, though the reconquests were incomplete and could not be maintained. The wars exhausted the empire's treasury, and many of Justinian's gains were lost within decades of his death. Italy was invaded by the Lombards in 568 CE, and the empire eventually retained only isolated enclaves around Rome, Ravenna, and southern Italy. Justinian's lasting achievements were cultural and legal rather than military. He ordered the compilation of all Roman law into a coherent system, the Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of civil law. This massive work, completed by legal scholars under the Juris Tribonian, preserved Roman legal thought and became the foundation for European legal systems. When medieval universities began teaching law, they taught Justinian's code. The concepts of property, contract, obligation, equity, and justice that underpin Western legal tradition are largely Roman, preserved through Justinian's compilation. Justinian also built extensively, most famously the Hagia Sophia, the great cathedral in Constantinople that still stands today. When it was completed in 537 CE, its massive dome was an engineering marvel without precedent. Justinian reportedly exclaimed upon entering, "Solomon, I have surpassed you," referring to Solomon's temple. The Hagia Sophia represented Byzantine civilization at its peak, Christian but preserving Roman architectural ambition, Greek mathematical knowledge applied to engineering problems, creating something unprecedented. But Justinian's reign also saw catastrophe. In 541 CE, plague arrived in Constantinople, possibly bubonic plague originating in Central Asia, spreading along trade routes. The Plague of Justinian, as it is called, killed perhaps half the empire's population over repeated outbreaks. Constantinople reportedly lost 40% of its population. The demographic catastrophe undermined Justinian's military ambitions and economic resources, contributing to the failure to hold his western reconquests. After Justinian, the empire faced new threats. In the early 7th century, the Sassanid Persians launched a massive invasion, conquering Syria, Palestine, and Egypt. In 626 CE, Persian and Avar forces besieged Constantinople itself. The siege failed, and the Emperor Heraclius launched a desperate counter-offensive, invading Persia and defeating the Sassanids at the Battle of Nineveh in 627 CE. He recovered the lost provinces, including the True Cross, which the Persians had captured from Jerusalem, seeming to have saved the empire. But both empires, Roman and Persian, were exhausted by decades of warfare. Neither was prepared for what came next. In the 630s CE, Arab armies erupted from Arabia, united by the new religion of Islam and its prophet Muhammad, who had died in 632 CE. The Arabs defeated Byzantine armies in Syria at the Yarmouk River in 636 CE and Persian armies in Iraq at Qadisiyah in 637 CE. Within 2 decades, the Arabs conquered Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and North Africa from the Byzantines and destroyed the Sassanid Persian Empire entirely. The shock was immense. Provinces that had been Roman for 6 centuries, including the Holy Lands where Christianity originated, were lost. Egypt's grain, which had fed Constantinople for centuries, was cut off. The empire contracted to Anatolia, the Balkans, and portions of Italy. The Byzantine Empire was now definitively Eastern, Greek-speaking, oriented towards survival rather than reconquest. The universal Roman Empire of Augustus and Constantine was gone, replaced by a Greek Christian empire in the east and Islamic caliphates in the south and east, with Latin Christian kingdoms in the west. The Byzantines adapted and survived. They developed the theme system, military administrative districts, where soldiers were granted land in exchange for hereditary military service, creating a native army rather than relying on mercenaries. Greek replaced Latin as the official language, acknowledging the empire's demographic reality. The emperor became more explicitly autocratic, styled as God's representative on earth, ruling through an elaborate bureaucracy and court ceremony that both impressed foreigners and maintained social order. Byzantine culture flourished despite military crises. Constantinople remained the greatest city in Christendom, wealthy, sophisticated, filled with palaces and churches and monuments. Byzantine art developed a distinctive style, mosaics and icons, stylized rather than naturalistic, using gold backgrounds to represent heaven, depicting Christ, Mary, and saints with intense spirituality. The iconoclasm controversy in the 8th and 9th centuries, when emperors banned religious images as idolatry, produced theological debates about representation and veneration that sharpened Christian thought. The Byzantine Empire's relationship with Western Europe was complex. When Charlemagne, king of the Franks, was crowned emperor by the Pope in Rome on Christmas Day 800 CE, the Byzantines were outraged. There was only one Roman emperor, ruling in Constantinople, the legitimate successor of Augustus. Who was this barbarian pretending to the title? But the West no longer looked to Constantinople for authority. The Pope, who had crowned Charlemagne, claimed authority from the successors of Peter rather than Eastern emperors. The split between Eastern and Western Christianity, already developing over theological and liturgical differences, was becoming political separation. The formal split, the Great Schism, came in 1054 CE, when mutual excommunications were issued between the Pope and the Patriarch of Constantinople. The issues were theological: the filioque clause in the Creed, papal authority, liturgical practices, but also cultural and political. Eastern and Western Christianity had grown apart. They were now separate communions, Orthodox and Catholic, both claiming to be the true church, both viewing the other as schismatic. The Byzantine Empire faced constant threats: Arabs from the south, Bulgars and later Turks from the north and east, Normans from the west. Yet it survived, sometimes thriving. The 10th century saw a Byzantine Renaissance under the Macedonian dynasty, with territorial expansion, cultural flowering, and economic prosperity. Basil III, emperor from 976 to 1025 CE, conquered Bulgaria and expanded the empire to its greatest extent since Justinian, earning the title Bulgar Slayer for his ruthless campaigns. But the 11th century brought new crises. The Seljuk Turks, nomadic warriors from Central Asia who had converted to Islam, invaded Anatolia, defeating the Byzantine army catastrophically at Manzikert in 1071 CE. Most of Anatolia, the empire's heartland and recruiting ground, was lost. In desperation, the Emperor Alexios V Komnenos appealed to the Western Pope Urban II for help. Urban responded by preaching the First Crusade in 1095 CE, calling Western knights to liberate the Holy Land from Muslim control. The Crusades' relationship with the Byzantine Empire was fraught. The Byzantines wanted mercenaries to help reconquer Anatolia. The Crusaders wanted to conquer Jerusalem and establish their own kingdoms. Mutual suspicion and cultural differences created tension. The Fourth Crusade in 1204 CE was diverted by Venetian commercial interests to attack Constantinople itself. The Crusaders sacked the Christian capital, destroying and looting on a scale that shocked even contemporaries. They established the Latin Empire in Constantinople, fragmenting the Byzantine Empire into successor states. The Byzantines eventually recaptured Constantinople in 1261 CE under Michael VIII Palaiologos, but the restored empire was a shadow of its former self. Weakened economically, threatened militarily, it survived only through diplomacy and the disunity of its enemies. The Ottoman Turks, successors to the Seljuks, gradually conquered Byzantine territory throughout the 14th century. By 1400 CE, the Byzantine Empire consisted of little more than Constantinople itself and a few scattered territories. The end came in 1453 CE. Sultan Mehmed Sen laid siege to Constantinople with an army of perhaps 80,000 men and advanced artillery that could breach even the great Theodosian walls that had protected the city for 1,000 years. Emperor Constantine VII, Palaiologos, the last Roman emperor, defended the city with perhaps 7,000 soldiers. On May 29th, after nearly 2 months of siege, the Ottomans breached the walls and poured into the city. Constantine died fighting in the breach, his body never identified. The Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, was finished. The fall of Constantinople shocked Christian Europe. Scholars fled west, bringing manuscripts that would fuel the Renaissance. The city became Istanbul, capital of the Ottoman Empire. The Hagia Sophia was converted to a mosque, but the empire's legacy endured. Byzantine legal traditions influenced Ottoman governance. Byzantine art influenced Islamic art. The Cyrillic alphabet, created by Byzantine missionaries to write Slavic languages, is still used by Russians and others. The Orthodox Church, shaped by Byzantine theology, continues in Greece, Russia, and elsewhere, preserving Byzantine liturgy and theology. Most importantly, Byzantium had preserved Roman and Greek culture through the medieval period. While Western Europe struggled through the early Middle Ages, Byzantium maintained libraries, copied manuscripts, preserved classical learning. When Western Europe rediscovered classical culture during the Renaissance, much came through Byzantine intermediaries. The Roman Empire, in its eastern continuation, had lasted from 27 BCE to 1453 CE, nearly 15 centuries. It was an extraordinary achievement of cultural continuity and political survival. Legacy. Rome's eternal imprint. We have travelled far through time, from the legendary founding on the Tiber's banks to the final fall of Constantinople to the Turks. 22 centuries of history, of rise and fall and transformation, of triumph and catastrophe. The Roman Empire in all its forms shaped the world in ways so deep we barely notice them, so pervasive they seem natural rather than historical accidents. The most obvious legacy is language. Latin evolved into the Romance languages, Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Romanian, spoken by hundreds of millions today. English, though Germanic in structure, borrowed so extensively from Latin and French that more than half its vocabulary has Latin roots. Scientific and medical terminology is Latin. Legal terms are Latin. Even when we speak English, we speak Latin without realizing it. Roman law is the foundation of most modern legal systems outside the English-speaking world. The concepts of contracts, property rights, legal personhood, inheritance, obligation, these are Roman concepts preserved through Justinian's compilation and medieval legal scholarship. The European Union's laws, the legal systems of Latin America, even Louisiana's civil law tradition in the United States, all trace back to Rome. The very idea that law should be written, systematic, apply equally to all citizens, is Roman architecture and engineering too bear Rome's stamp. The arch, the vault, the dome. These were perfected by Roman engineers and remain fundamental to construction. Concrete was a Roman invention, lost after the empire's fall and not equaled until the modern age. Amphitheatres, aqueducts, roads, baths, the infrastructure that enabled Roman civilization, still impress us. The Pantheon's dome remains the largest unreinforced concrete dome ever built. Roman roads still form the basis of European road networks. The very word street comes from via strata, paved road. Christianity, the world's largest religion, is inseparable from Roman history. It emerged in a Roman province, spread through Roman networks, was persecuted by Roman emperors, adopted by Roman emperors, shaped by Roman administration, defined by Roman councils. The Catholic Church's hierarchical structure mirrors Roman provincial administration. The Pope's title, Pontifex Maximus, was originally the Roman chief priest's title. Catholic liturgy preserves Latin, the calendar of saints and feasts, the theology of the Trinity, the canon of Scripture. All these were determined within the Roman imperial context. Political concepts too are Roman. Republic, Senate, consul, dictator, province, colony, citizen. These words come from Roman political vocabulary and carry Roman assumptions about governance. The United States Constitution's framers consciously imitated Roman republicanism, creating a Senate, dividing powers, establishing term limits, fearing tyranny as Romans had. The fasces appear in the US House of Representatives as symbols of authority. Modern imperialism, for good and ill, modeled itself on Roman precedent, the civilizing mission that justified conquest. Even our concepts of time are Roman. The calendar we use is the Julian calendar reformed by Pope Gregory, still named for Julius Caesar. The months bear Roman names: July for Julius Caesar, August for Augustus, September through December from Latin numbers. Our week combines Jewish and Roman tradition. Our dating system counts from Christ's supposed birth, but that birth happened under Roman rule, dated by Roman census in the reign of Caesar Augustus. The cultural memory of Rome has shaped Western civilization's self-understanding. For medieval Europeans, Rome was the lost golden age of order and learning. For Renaissance humanists, Rome provided the classical culture to emulate. For Enlightenment thinkers, Rome offered lessons in republican virtue and imperial decadence. For Romantic-era artists, Rome's ruins symbolized the grandeur and fragility of human achievement. For modern historians, Rome is the case study in empire's rise and fall. Yet Rome's legacy is also contested and problematic. The empire was built on conquest and maintained by slavery. Roman triumphs meant other people's defeats. The gladiatorial games entertained Romans with human death. Roman law enshrined inequality, treating women, slaves, and non-citizens as legally inferior. Roman imperialism justified subjugation of barbarians needing civilization, a template for later European colonialism's racism. When we celebrate Rome, we must remember what that celebration excludes. The voices of the conquered, the enslaved, the marginalized. The question historians debate is whether Rome's fall was decline or transformation. The traditional narrative, from Gibbon's Decline and Fall onward, sees Rome's end as catastrophe, civilization giving way to barbarism, light extinguished by darkness. This narrative shaped how Europeans understood their own history. The Middle Ages as dark compared to classical antiquity and the Renaissance. Modern historians see the picture as more complex. The barbarians who took over Western provinces were often Romanized, preserving what they could of Roman culture while adapting it to new circumstances. The economic prosperity and urban culture of the early empire were unsustainable, dependent on conquest plunder. The transformation into medieval Europe, while involving loss and violence, also created new forms of organization, new cultural syntheses, new possibilities. Byzantine continuation shows Roman resilience. Islamic caliphates preserved Greek philosophy and science Rome had transmitted. Medieval monasteries copied Roman manuscripts. The Renaissance recovered classical learning. Each age reinterpreted Rome for its purposes. Perhaps the deepest legacy is the idea of universal empire, of civilization transcending ethnicity and geography. Rome at its height offered citizenship to anyone, regardless of origin, who adopted Roman culture and law. It united the Mediterranean basin in peace, facilitating exchange of goods and ideas across vast distances. Later empires, Byzantine, Islamic, Carolingian, Holy Roman, British, American, all claim to continue or emulate Roman achievement of universal order. That legacy is ambiguous. Universalism can mean inclusion and toleration, or it can mean imposing one culture's values on others. Empire can bring peace and prosperity, or exploitation and oppression. Rome demonstrated both possibilities, sometimes simultaneously. When we invoke Rome today, in political rhetoric, in architecture, in law, we are invoking this ambiguous legacy, claiming continuity with an empire that was both extraordinary achievement and cautionary tale. As we close this long journey through Roman history, from Romulus to Romulus Augustulus, from the 7 hills to the 1,000-year empire, from myth to history to memory, what should we take away? Perhaps this, that civilizations rise and fall, that power is temporary, that what seems eternal is contingent, but also that human achievement endures, that ideas and institutions outlive empires, that culture adapts and survives transformation. Rome is dead. Long live Rome. The empire is gone, but its ghost haunts our world. When you speak, when you build, when you make laws, when you organize governments, when you think about power and authority and civilization, you are thinking with concepts Rome created or shaped. The eternal city earned its name not because it endures unchanged, but because it transformed into something beyond itself, an idea, a memory, a foundation on which much of the world was built. If this journey through Rome's story has fascinated you, if the rise and fall of civilization has sparked your imagination, consider subscribing to this channel for more explorations of history's great stories. And tell me, where are you listening from tonight? And what historical journey would you like to take next? Perhaps the Mongol conquests or the Byzantine Empire in more depth, or the Islamic Golden Age, or the Age of Exploration. The past is vast, filled with stories waiting to be told in the quiet hours when the modern world fades and history speaks. Until we meet again in these nocturnal hours, sleep well, dream of marble columns and distant frontiers, of eagles and legions, of emperors and philosophers, of an empire that spanned the known world and shaped all that came after. Rest peacefully. knowing that the achievements and failures of those long-dead Romans still echo in the world you'll wake to tomorrow. Good night, and may history's long memory bring you the peace that Rome, for all its power, could never quite secure for itself.